So this will take a few weeks to go through. Soul and Spirit.
Yes. Yes.
Chewy stuff. And of course, as he did in one of the previous ones, he starts right off the bat by firing a volley of references. And it's at moments like that that you can see that he's not just a philosopher, but also a philosophy teacher, and also incredibly widely read. And the intersection of those three things means that for him, the obvious thing to do when you're bringing up a subject is to start by saying, well, we are not the first people to talk about this. So, who else is in this area? Who do we need to be conversing with in addition to each other? And I appreciate that. It's really interesting for me going through essays where he does this, because he basically lays out a whole course of reading. And it'll take months to get through all those philosophers, and not all of their work, but merely the parts of their work that directly apply to the current essay, right? And that's a different way to read other philosophers. We're saying, well, I'm not just sitting down to read Plato's Republic, the end, beginning, and I'm done. I'm sitting down to try to find everything Plato said about daimones and free will specifically. And so it forces you to cover a lot of different ground and put things together from different works. And when you do that, you break free of certain silos of academia that encourage you to see all these things as separate creations. And you start to see the flow of unified thought of the philosopher across time, what they're wrestling with, how they thought. And it's really interesting with philosophers like Nietzsche, where they change their minds dramatically from the beginning of their career to the end of their career. Because then you're not just getting an opinion, but you're getting a whole dialectical argument that someone's having on a subject. What do they think about it? How did they change? Why did they change? And so on. So I really, I really enjoy these, even though for moderns used to being able to read text that is laid out at a 6th grade level or 8th grade level, or wherever they're targeting it, in newspapers, where everything is pre-digested and all the conclusions are laid out for us, and all we have to do is take it in and so on. It's extremely difficult. You just can't read Kenneth that way at all. You get a sentence or two into it, and then you're like, wait, what? What now? What the hell? So I suspected there would be some of that from people this week, despite the fact that we're enjoying the reading. So I thought we would start with opening remarks, and I see that Sharon and Phil have already beat me to the punch.
So I have a quick question as we're starting. I wanted to get the framework for the italicized sections that he used as an introduction to this essay, because I had to read that a couple of times to really put it in the context. Is he talking to somebody?
Yes.
What is he doing here?
You want to know what's shocking? What's shocking is that an essay this chewy and dense and full of stuff was just an email he jotted off. This is a conversation that he was having with Joshua Stevens. Joshua Stevens sent him an email, and it takes Kenneth a few days or sometimes weeks, depending on the questions, to respond. But then when he does, he's like, it's like an essay. And so that's what you're getting here with the italicization. And in the case of right on the first page, you can see that Joshua is not only writing to him, but Joshua is quoting Kenneth from an earlier email and asking him about that quote. So the italics are Joshua's quotes then? Yes. Yes, those 3 indented bits. Before "yeah you wish," after "yeah you wish," and before "no sophisticated here." The paragraphs beginning "I am pasting," "as usual there are," and "when you say." Those are Joshua. And in the middle is 20th century vitalism, is Joshua quoting Kenneth, back at Kenneth and going, wait a minute now. Okay. All right. So would it help if I should probably put little attributions in there, like they do in plays, who's speaking now. Yes, because I had to read it a couple of times and I still didn't get the full framework of it. So I just tried to understand the content. Yes. Okay, so play style, attributions. Good. That's a good comment. Phil, then Dave.
Yeah, I have a brief comment to Sharon's thing, and then my comment. I was sort of curious that he chose that specific type because I used to teach type, and it's a type called Poetica. It is a modern interpretation of a early Renaissance type when type first came out,
Yes.
and it was like when the humanist type was being transitioned from the black letter to
Yes.
the so-called white letter. The white letter meaning is not white, reverse type, it meaning like there's so much space in between the types so that when you read it, you don't get this heavy
Right.
medieval feeling. Okay.
Right.
So the fact that he chose that early typeface, and particularly his name Poetica, seems interesting. Rather, and the italics particularly is an attempt to in a way flourish italic, because in the early type there wasn't in a way a italics. The italic was incorporated slightly later into typography, and so not only the dates, but the fact that it incorporated in order to bring in more of the handwriting gesture
Yes.
to type. So
Yes.
that's kind of interesting. It makes to me a little problematic in the sense that it's a little more difficult to read because
Yes.
of our modern push to a kind of efficient way of reading.
Yes.
So that itself is an interesting thing. So that's a brief answer from a typographer, that he wanted to place it at that, in a way, a decisive moment when print came into being. I mean, the real print, Gutenberg came first, but
Right.
this came shortly after Gutenberg. So it also signified the transition from the medieval religious context into a humanistic context, because it's a
Yes.
humanistic writing.
Yes.
So that is very, very interesting.
Yes.
And the way that he incorporated a kind of modern aspect of trying to fuse together into a system two ways of writing that is actually contrary to each other,
Yes.
and together is
Yes.
also I think he must have thought about that, even though he's probably not a typographer. He must have even been advised by that, or he thought about it. So that's an interesting response. But the question I wanted to ask is, like, where did the problem begin? I asked this question because I attended a Kierkegaard meeting and they were talking about the problem of Abraham. And I tried to introduce this idea that the problem of Abraham really could be seen as a late, because I said, which Abraham are we talking about? The Abraham of the Jews or the Abraham of Christianity?
Right.
And the reason I asked that question, and they didn't really want to hear it, this group, because the Abraham, remember the Abraham of the of the Hebrews was that, first of all, there was no laws when Abraham came about. Moses came later, and only then did God deliver the Torah, the commandments. Okay, so I'll have something to say, but not now, later, about that particular situation. But nonetheless, in the Hebrew tradition, it grew up in terms of the tradition of interpretations, because the Torah was always companioned by the Talmud, which is great scholars interpreting the humanists, that humanity interpreting the laws of God, which are very, very vague and sort of nebulous. You could say it's kind of got this sort of Zen idea of infinite, you don't know. Okay, so they coexisted. And then when you go to the Christianity, then they have to go back to Plato. Plato, many people mischaracterize Plato in a way, because they thought he was the guy that institutionalize this sort of like sort of streamline orthodoxy into whatever it is. But remember, in the divided line, the forms, he never explained what the forms were. The forms were really a kind of aspiration to achieve, I guess, in his mind, when you could remember your past and understand what the forms were that we've all forgotten. Okay. And the closer you come to the form that could be manifested was mathematics, very much influenced, I think, by Pythagoras. And I think the Renaissance, well, not the Renaissance in a sense, particularly misinterpreted. And what Augustine did was the aspiration, which is man's ascent to the forms, was left in a mythic form, even though he definitely sided with philosophy over the poets. But nonetheless, he wrote in the poetic form. So which itself is a contradiction, which is interesting. But when Augustine got hold of Plato, and I profess that Augustine loved Plato as much as he loved God, that he transformed Plato's reach into the forms, which he now called the mind of God, okay? Which in a sense turn that forms upside down because mankind could never reach the forms. Augustine says God is there to help. Now the question is to what degree. So God, the mind, which is infinite, reaches down to, in a sense, give you, in a sense, connect to the form, I guess, to, the spirit or whatever, okay? So in some sense, I think the real rupture then came. So if you understood that, in a sense, that God reaches down in order to complete the relationship, God was incredibly important because it made the connection to the spirit, as well as to the intellect. And then when Christianity broke down, and that's when Kierkegaard came along, it was then the last crisis in which then man is left adrift. And that's why I brought in Beethoven. Beethoven now, if you look at a statue, when I gave a lecture on that, I gave a statue of the Apollo Belvedere, which show, if you look at the face of Apollo Belvedere, it was like Apollo had this sort of divine, calm look in his face, which is a Renaissance copy of, I think that was an original Roman copy of the Greek. But when you look at David already had the modern man because he was very determined in a sense when he confronted Goliath, right? So you could see that his destiny was very human, but he was sort of like confident because God still stood with him, right? And so he had this determined look because he has to carry out the activity of God. But so his participation was very important, but he was backed up by God. When Beethoven came along, there was no God. And so if you look at the statue of Beethoven, he's always scowling, like very intense, because he knew that he was there, in a sense, as the hero to save man into the spirit, in that sense, right? And so in that sense, Beethoven was in many ways very much like Napoleon, because Napoleon crowned himself because mankind must now take over the responsibility. So in some sense, it's back to Plato, the ascent of man, but in some sense, because it was no longer a memory to retrieve the memory that we've forgotten, the forms, but in a sense to push forward, because now oriented to the future rather than the past, because it's not a memory, but a production. Okay. So that was interesting. Of course, when Beethoven, I think I might have read that quote to you later. Well, maybe not to this group. Maybe I'll read, if I could find it, if I could read it. It's a very interesting
May I
quote.
just interject a minute here? You know, Phil is losing me. So can you help me, Rick, please?
So
Because I can't see all of this in this essay. I'm lost. And I am one that speaks up when I'm lost. So Phil, I'm totally lost.
So she's looking for the connection, Phil, between what you were describing and the essay. Kind of what was it in the essay that grabbed you and made you excited about these connections across these thousands of years?
Well, I thought in the essay that he was a little too polemical. He kind of maybe was a bit harsh on Kant, because I think Kant was trying to save what was left over. He couldn't solve it, so he did make a mistake in that sense, right? But nonetheless, I thought he was a bit too harsh, and he seemed to be a little too snotty about all sorts of people, because like now he's going to institutionalize. I mean, he's going to write the course, but in fact, his way of thinking has a lot to owe to the past.
Yes.
In that sense, right? So in some sense, he maybe should not be quite as snotty as he should have been, but he's not wrong, but he's perhaps a little bit like, now I'm going to straighten the situation out. So that's why I said, and I think a lot of what I'm trying to explain, in a sense, maybe he didn't touch directly because he didn't mention Augustine, right?
Right.
I think he might have mentioned Plato, but barely, right? He mentioned the Greeks in general. And I think that was very important. I mean, maybe he should have mentioned Kierkegaard. I mean, I think he did, but maybe more so.
Right.
So I was also a little upset that he didn't mention enough of Jung.
Right.
Jung was very important. And I thought he missed the opportunity. Maybe he didn't like Jung. So I don't know. Maybe he didn't like the idea of the what the Jung called the
Collective unconscious.
Collective unconscious. Maybe that's a thing. Maybe he didn't want it to be just unconscious, even though it's collective. So I don't know. So I think he left out certain things that he should have put in, but nonetheless, he's on the right road, and he should have credit all these people in the sense of not necessarily a footnote, but a nod to them that they were also necessary to get to the point he was at.
So what you're saying is these are the other people who he did a lot of references, but he didn't do enough of the references. He's leaving out some of the critical people. That's the connection. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And what I'm hearing is Phil citing people who are part of the background and subtext of this essay. Knowing Kenneth the way I do, I know he's thinking about those people while he's writing about these people. There's a way in which the things that Phil is bringing up are part of the taken for granted context behind the essay, even though he doesn't cite them.
Could I complete that by saying what I want to say about Beethoven?
Yeah.
Because Beethoven actually took the torch, and that's why I call him the most important man of the 19th century. He said, and I'm not a Beethoven scholar, but he said something that is very important to me, very mysterious. He said, music is the one incorporeal entrance, this is interesting, into the higher world of knowledge, which comprehends us. Music understands us, but which comprehends mankind, but which mankind cannot comprehend. In that statement is like he is leading us back to the spirit, but he says the spirit still remains mysterious, because the second which is the which I'm very interesting, but which mankind cannot comprehend. Is mankind not comprehending the entrance, the pathway that music provides, the higher knowledge or even himself. He left that kind of mysterious, right? It's like it might be that we don't understand any of it, but nonetheless, music does provide a way for us to get at least a hint, which in some ways resembles Plato.
Yes.
A hint of the forms, but we could never ascribe it like through a logic positional tool, right? Which is very interesting, and I kind of agree with that. But when is that ambiguous, it could be taken in the wrong direction, as Wagner did, went too far in the wrong direction, or it could go in a more positive direction. So that's my thought.
This essay revved you up. They're real good there. It got you thinking about this larger context. Well, the general schema in my brain, which I'm not sticking to, but which is kind of a default way to go, pending what everybody would like to do, is that after Mythos and Logos, next we would tackle his book Human Natures, where he breaks down the Benauseia and Douleia and Aristeia and how they relate to each other. And then after that, we could do Millennia and Microcosm, which is his essays that break down the ancient world, the medieval world, and the modern world, and how they relate to each other. Because then you're getting his system from two different levels, the personal level and then the big epochal, level. And it's especially as we do that move that the things you're talking about, Phil, are going to come to the foreground, because he talks a lot about Augustine and Plato and their role in the development of Christianity. And then later, Aquinas and Aristotle and their role in transforming Christianity to being, shall we say, less hostile to science, more ready to hear what the Arabic philosophers had discovered about the Greeks through their experimentation. So all of this stuff you're talking about, lights me up. But, in this essay, as Sharon says, it's in the background. Kenneth is thinking it, but he's not actually saying it.
Can I just say one thing, though? And this is for Phil. The Abrahamic religions also include Islam. And that was the one caustic comment that he had in here. That was the only one that I picked up. So thank you for that.
Yeah. Okay. So next up is Dave. Go ahead.
I'll be somewhat brief because I have a lot of comments once we get into the meat of the essay.
Sure.
But I thought this was quintessential Kenneth Smith. It's a trenchant critique on all forms of abstractivism, primarily the market-based capitalism and scientism, as well as fideism or religiosity or dogmatic religion. Those three, I think he really took to task in an exceptional way, and I enjoyed reading it. I just, as a matter of procedure, on page 102, I think I found a typo in the...
what is it?
It's in the... after the last paragraph, the first paragraph on the page, there's a double word, CC. We CC the de facto human order too much.
Oops, there it is. Got it. Thank you.
And I'll just reserve the rest of my comments for as we walk through the essay. And maybe we should just take it sequentially, if I could suggest that, because there's a lot of meat here.
Yeah, we'll work our way through from the beginning. That's a good idea.
That will stop me from becoming confused. Thank you.
So before we dive in, one quick comment. So about the typeface, Phil is right about the relationship of this text to Poetica, except this isn't actually Poetica.
Oh, really?
This is a typeface from the same designer, Robert Bringhurst, and this is from late in his career, when he took the ideas of Poetica and brought them up to date with all those things he'd learned over the decades as a typographer. This typeface is called Brioso, and it is based on Robert Bringhurst's own writing, his handwriting, which as a typographer he cultivated for decades. And he was trying to learn to write the way that those Renaissance scholars wrote. Then that hand was the hand that inspired the invention of typography as we know it today, in exactly the period Phil's talking about. Kenneth didn't pick this typeface, I did, because I'm a typographer like Phil.
Oh, okay.
I'm a typophile. I'm crazy for type. He usually writes in Book Antiqua, because he has cheap computers that don't have a good selection of fonts. Book Antiqua was a ripoff of Palatino, which was developed by Hermann Zopf during the 20th century. Hermann Zopf was a master typographer who was not only comfortable with modernist trends in typography, but also wanted to reach back to the early stages of the invention of movable type. And so Palatino was his homage to that same era that Robert Bringhurst now in this typeface is doing an homage to. And you're right also about the tension between the Roman and the italic. I use it deliberately throughout this essay, throughout this book, as to reflect a dialectic between a more modernist perspective, a more Apollonian perspective, and a more Dionysian perspective. And that's why when there are quotes that are talking about that are people's opinions and reactions, those come through in italic. All the usual things come through in italic, but also when he's quoting Hegel or Heraclitus or Nietzsche or other philosophers who are sort of breaking with or rupturing modernist preconceptions, those quotes, I won't put them in quote marks. I'll just throw them into the swash version of Brioso, like it's a voice speaking from an alien mindset. So this is me overthinking things as a typographer and also trying to make it look nice, but Kenneth knew I was going to do this to his text. I warned him back in 2003. I wanted there to be a typography for philosophy that would that could do justice to what he was doing.
You should consider including some of that in the book somewhere. It's sort of like those DVD commentaries from the filmmaker, and they're telling you all these things that you didn't at first appreciate, because that's fascinating, Rick, and I'm sure readers of the book would like to know that.
I'll put a little colophon at the end that introduces the typefaces and why they're there. But so I was thrilled that Phil actually picked up on it and saw what it was and what it was doing, because the one of the most famous theorists of typography of the 20th century, Beatrice Ward, compared excellence in typography to a crystal goblet, in which you mostly don't see the goblet, you see the wine, and that's the whole point, is that you see the message that's being carried and not the work of the typographer. Typographers call it the invisible art. And when it starts to be obtrusive and like the granola fonts of the sixth poster fonts, rock and roll poster fonts, when people try to set essays and that sort of thing, it's like, no, you're way too calling attention to yourself. You have to vanish and let the voice of the author speak through. So
well, let me just make a brief compliment to you. It's like typeface, learning typefaces and text type is a very, very subtle art form, because its beauty is really in its subtlety. And because there's not very much room before A becomes another letter, right, it has to be subtle to begin with, particularly when it's like 9 points or even 10 points, but people used to read it as small as 6 points. Right. I mean, that was normal reading in a way. It used to be. So compliment to you for being a typographer. Even people who are designers don't understand typography.
Yeah, it's hard. Anyway, so there's the background on the typeface. So yeah, let's go through from the beginning of this essay. Kenneth obviously right off the bat is responding to Joshua's claim that there's some way to get caught up on responding, because just like in these very seminars we're doing now, so it was in the email list, as Donald and David can attest. There was an enormous backlog of issues that had been raised by emails, and people would do what they thought was a simple response, going, "Oh, when you said this, you must have meant that." And Kenneth's like, "Oh dear God, here it comes. I have to write a book to answer that." So there was always a backlog of things that didn't get done, and that's how the mailing list never ended. It sort of trailed off, and occasionally people post things to it, but it's still in exactly the same state. It's never going to be done. It's an endless thing. I used to ask Kenneth, what does he recommend as the right curriculum for philosophy? What should we read first? What should we read second? How do we get into it? And he said, "Oh, no. You can't do that." He says, "What you do is you teach the student. So you get the student to start talking, and they will tell you what matters to them. And that's where you begin. And the reason you can do that is that when you're dealing with the infinite, everything connects to everything else. And so it almost doesn't matter where you begin, as long as you begin someplace that people care about." And that's why this book we didn't try to hide the fact that these are emails. We tried to foreground it because it's that very technique in action. It's like, well, whatever is on somebody's mind, let's start talking there,
Okay.
right? Someday, we're going to get him on one of these things, and he's going to do exactly the same thing. It's like, well, whatever people bring up is going to become the meat of the conversation, and that's also why, when I say, well, I think we might do human nature as a Millennium microcosm next, I don't really mean that I'm going to force us to do that at all. On the contrary, that's just a default safety net. And what we're actually going to do is we're going to talk about whatever the group is most excited about, because that's where we learn. That's where we get engaged and discover things. So vitalism. You were going to ask about vitalism, Sharon, right?
Well, what was interesting to me in the two philosophers that he mentioned in this first page, Bergson and how do you say the next one? Merleau-Ponty?
Merleau-Ponty.
Merleau-Ponty was their different approach to reality. And that I found very interesting because it was different than what I have been reading, particularly for Bergson's approach to reality by process, because I'm a process person. So I found that intriguing. And if you would expound on how they both contribute to what he called vitalism, which is a new word in this context for me.
Right. So vitalism is a loaded term here. Part of the reason it's a loaded term is that Kenneth's take on Nietzsche, like the take of Nietzsche's main translator, is that Nietzsche was less about the things that people think Nietzsche's about, and more at his root, he was about vitalism. He was about trying to find a worldview and a philosophy and an ethos that would make people more alive, more creative, more engaged with the world, more caring about the things that matter, not because they think they should, but because they actually do. Trying to transform kind of the inner life of human beings to plug us into that live wire experience of the infant in a way that connects us to the world more completely, that makes us more here, more alive. And it's why Nietzsche is often self-aggrandizing in his essays. Nietzsche was an egotist, and there are times when you read his stuff and you're like, oh, come on. But then, as his translator points out, some of the times when he's making his grandiose claims, he's actually right. Like, for example, he was the first serious European philosopher of the modern age who completely broke with the dry academic style. Everybody else was trying to beat Kant at his own game. They're trying to be even drier, even more abstruse, even more methodical. And Nietzsche said, you know what? No, I want to be more alive than Kant. I want to be more alive than any philosopher who's written in the last couple of centuries. And there's no denying that you start picking up a passage of Nietzsche, and it is impossible to miss the imprint of the personality because he's alive on the page there. He succeeded at that, right? So in doing that, Nietzsche was trying by example as well as by argument to criticize modernism's entire schema, which says that we shouldn't be focused on life, we should be focused on means, on control and organization and schemas, and that's the way you make a civilization work, not on an individual's power to be alive and to perceive and understand, but on a society's power to organize itself and dominate the natural world and its own citizens. And so there are these kind of two. I mean, Nietzsche's right that there are these two big thrusts struggling in modernism for domination. This kind of suppressed organic naturalist vitalist drive within human nature and the world at large, and then this schematizing hyper Apollonian, hyper Verstand kind of. I think Kenneth used the word deathworks. That's about being aseptic and sterilized in order to get completely reproducible, behavior every time. The law, a purified form of the law, a purified form of agriculture, a purified form of economy, everything stripped of all value, just like Kant was stripping. He was trying to strip his text of anything subjective. And so in the 20th century, therefore, it was writing at a time when people still misunderstood Nietzsche because of the things that his sister had done to his publications, making him seem to be an anti-Semite, making him seem to be a German nationalist, and all those things. At that time when Nietzsche was least accessible, here comes Bergson, who is also pushing a vitalist program in his writings, we couldn't even say that he was following the easy example of Nietzsche. He was really just, again, trying to blaze the same trail anew, fresh. And then, of course, Merleau-Ponty picks it up again. And part of what they critique in this is, in these calls before, we've talked about the difference between science as it aspires to be and as it sometimes manages to be when it's about profound insights into the cosmos and understanding our place and so forth, versus at other times when it gets stripped down into a faith-based schema, where it's like people may not actually be doing science, but they want to cloak themselves in science so that they can be an authority that you're forced to listen to, because science is given this kind of semi-religious position in our society. In which this is what he calls a fideism of science, or a scientism, where we worship the lab coat, or we worship the imprimatur of scientists say. You know what I mean? And this is where you see people failing to do due diligence on articles submitted to Nature, because the magazine Nature acquires that imprimatur of authority, and people start believing whatever it says, even if the stuff hasn't been checked scientifically and rigorously. So there's this diremption between science fully practiced the way it's meant to be done, and science, the affectation or the tropes, the clothing of science, which could very well mask, the exact opposite. That's one set of problems that's hiding in this discussion he has, where he's going after scientism's one side, causality and mechanism. But he's also doing simultaneously, and that's hard enough for most moderns to grasp, first of all. Right? The fact that the word science is used to describe both things really successfully confuses us. I mean, the public at large buys into this idea that if we call it science, it's science, even if it's not. But underneath that, Kenneth is doing a second level criticism, which is highly informed by Bergson and Merleau-Ponty, and that is that science, even at its best, has become so divorced from philosophy, so focused on metrics and measurability, that it has limited itself to Verstand understanding and cut itself off from Vernunft understanding. It has made itself hyper competent to handle things that can be measured and controlled, but incompetent to handle things that are more important than that, and more directly relevant to our lives, and more affect the quality of our lives. So we can build a bomb, and science can tell us how to do that. But should we build a bomb, science has cut itself off from all the avenues of investigating truth or right or wrong that would let us answer that question. You know what I mean? There's this sense in which the focus on means is so great that we lose track of the ends, the teleology. We lose track of what are the life-giving principles that any civilization has to follow to avoid destroying itself. And all of that is defined away outside the scope of science. And so science focuses just on the Verstand side, the noetic side, and leaves the gnosic side orphaned and atrophied. Now, there are lots of individual scientists and fans of science who don't like that part of science, and they try to describe it as though that too is supposed to be part of science. And they're right that it should be part of a philosophy of, or an epistemology of nature, of actually knowing things. Knowing things out of context with what the consequences are, or what we ought to do with that information. They're right that would be wrong. But at that moment when they do that, they're losing sight of science as a historical phenomenon that grew up in the shadow of the medieval church, and that had to cede, for its own survival, it had to cede all the big questions to the church. It had to treat that as the third rail it would never touch. And so it trained itself to become a specifically Verstand phenomena for investigating life. The fact that aristic-leaning scientists and lovers of science try to, in their own lives and in their own work, try to bring back that missing element and wish that it would spread throughout science, that's very cool and very humanizing and very important. But at the moment when they confuse what they're doing and say, well, science was always this way, and that what's happened is that it's fallen short and we're neglecting these other things, they're misunderstanding what science is. Science is a specific historical phenomena from a specific era, and it's a subset of a larger search for truth and meaning that goes beyond science.
Mhm.
So when Merleau-Ponty and Bergson, when Kenneth Smith, when Feyerabend, when these people critique science, it's very easy to get confused and think that they're also critiquing all search for knowledge, and they're really not. They're confusing the specific, very limited, Verstand-oriented form of science that grew up under the Catholic Church and has blossomed in the modern era. So that's some opening comments about the opening paragraphs. And the role of vitalism then is saying, what is it that we see in the real world of nature and biology and living systems that's missing from the mechanistic worldview that a hyper-Verstand form of science gives us? That was the avenue that these guys were going at. That was their line of attack. And Kenneth loves that stuff.
Can I just be out of turn here? If everybody else will permit me, because I think what you just said is so relevant, because I think that's where we are today. And the fact that they're raising these questions then and now, I do not think we've come up with a methodology to deal with it. For example, we're now at CRISPR, where we could make the perfect human being. We can do it. Should we do it?
Right.
And that's exactly what you're saying. And I think here he calls it extrinsic. He says that science is so extrinsic that he ignores the internal part of it.
Yes.
Am I getting that right?
Yes.
Can I go next? Because I was just about to say what Sharon was going to say, and I promise I'll be brief, Phil. I think there's two dimensions of the critique here. Not only does science elevate quantity and counting over quality and maybe caring, but also exactly what Sharon said here, and I'll just quote, I think this is really trenchant, quote, the metaphysical fallacy in terms of which it tries to think, that all law is to it inherently extrinsic. There is no kind of intrinsic or essential or internal lawfulness as such.
Yes.
And I think that is a critique you can apply to all forms of abstractivism, that they are imposing from outside and fail to recognize anything that comes from within. And that naturally leads to the conversation of the soul and spirit. Thank you, Phil, for indulging us.
Yeah.
Well said, Dave. Well said.
This is good stuff. And what you just said, Dave, is not only a feature, it itself is an essentialist feature of this approach. And the reason it's essentialist is there is a direct contradiction between my ability to manipulate the world and the world having any desires of its own to be something. If I'm trying to make a tree into my house, right, I'm doing so against its own nature, which is not to become a house. And it's one thing to do that to a rock or a tree, but we also do it to each other, right? I want to make people into my slaves or into my resources that will allow me to profit. I want to make this wilderness into my oil pumping station. There is this way in which Verstand abstracts the world to drain away all the value-laden parts of it in order to justify its right to then impose itself upon what is now an empty world that it couldn't possibly be violating the norms of. And that's why modernism, as it arose in counter-reaction against medievalism, took the devil's bargain that science had made with the medieval church and turned it up to 11 and said, oh, we like that about you. Yeah, don't make any value judgments. We want you to produce useful information that gives us power to have a Verstand control over the world, but we don't want any of your value judging cooties on it. We don't want you talking about human rights and how it's wrong to have slaves and how we shouldn't destroy continents just to that stuff's gross. We want you to give us all the stuff about how to do it. Tell us about how to make railroads to be able to get to the interior. We want better saws for cutting down the trees. We want better manacles for our slaves. That stuff's good. Give us all that stuff, science. But don't you dare talk about human rights or ecosystems, and if you destroy them, it's bad, or any of that. So that same evacuation that the ego does when it looks at the world and creates an abstract schema that makes the world useful to it is the same thing modernism does when it looks at the natural world and all the existing indigenous traditional cultures and says, I could really make a killing out of all this. And it's okay because none of this means anything. It has to be a mechanistic world in order to justify the nihilism of modernism. So yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out, Dave, because this is getting right into the parts of modernism that moderns don't like to talk about. But that they feel you're being unfair and mean if you talk about these things. You're introducing all these arbitrary pessimistic value judgments. And you shouldn't be talking about that because we're the greatest civilization that ever existed. And we see things better than anybody ever did. And we care more about human rights. The list goes on, right, about why you shouldn't say these things. And yet when you look at our history, the history is incomprehensible unless you say these things and see it, because then it all comes into focus.
Rick, could I just make a very quick comment about what you just said? I feel like, I guess that's what evolved brain, human brain does, is because there are no other living organisms behave like that, only the human race, right? So that's what you get for having such a bright, evolved brain.
Yeah, whatever Verstand capabilities other species have, and they do have those capabilities, they're not actually Verstand, they're noesis. They're noesis held together coherently with gnosis. They use both. When you watch the film My Octopus Teacher, and you get to see the inner life of the octopus expressed through its behavior and the way it learns things, you can see that it's engaging in noesis as well as gnosis. It's doing both things. But what it never does is drain away all the gnosis and suppress it to the background and just become a Verstand noesis monster the way a person does. There's something special in us that has the ability to suppress one or the other side, not to eliminate it, of course, to do something far more tangled and confusing with it. So you're right, Ginny. This is very close to our core species strategy. And it's worth pointing out that if you were to read everything you could in the current scientific literature about the evolution of Homo sapiens, that talks about what is our secret sauce, what has happened to us that makes us a species different from other species. Their lack of clarity about gnosis and noesis, about the roles of Begriff, Verstand, and Vernunft, about how the ego works, how spirit works, how all these things about the ways that the different mental faculties conceive of the world and relate to each other is all missing, because it's missing from our language. All the scientists grew up speaking English or German or what have you, and these languages just aren't lending themselves to the ability to come in and understand what it is that they're seeing when they see Homo sapiens evolve. And so as a result, you get these childlike explanations. Oh, it's because we have hands. The thumb is a mighty instrument. Or, oh, we found fire. Fire good. Fire made us strong. I mean, literally, it all boils down to kindergarten bumper stickers. The level of understanding that says, well, we got this mental faculty that was able to be unhooked from its moors, and that expanded the frame of human behavior, but at the cost of expanding the frame of human behavior. This is like not part of the discussion in any coherent, systematic way, right? Evolutionary biologists need Hegel. They need this vitalist investigation of the structure of the mind and culture in order to really understand why we evolved. And Ginny, you just threw it out there, and you were right on the mark in a way that, thousands and thousands of pages of evolutionary biological writing, one of my favorite areas, evolutionary biological writing about Homo sapiens, mostly fails to understand. And you had it like that. Yes.
I just also want to mention there was a professor, Yale professor, Nicholas Christakis, was on this a show called On Being, NPR. Have you heard of Krista Tippett on Being on Sunday mornings?
I haven't.
Anyway, what he was basically saying is that mostly when we philosophize about human race and everything, we very often talk about the negative quality of human race. But what he wanted to talk about is the positive quality of human race. What other species do you know, for example, will say hello to a stranger on the street, or what he was basically saying is all the positive qualities of human race, and he wanted to move away from all these negativity that we have tendency to talk about human race. And you know, I guess he does have a point. I mean, very often when we talk about the horrible things that we have done throughout history, you know, people like Hitler and all these dictators and blah blah blah. Anyway, he has written a book on that subject.
Very cool.
Yeah,
we'll follow up. Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
Before I call on Phil, since Phil got a chance to talk earlier in this, I'm going to call on Marianne, who hasn't yet this call. So
hi, you guys. I'm sorry I'm late. I wanted to share that Charles Eisenstein wrote a book on climate, a new story. And in it, we're talking about getting in touch. Like what I hear is like getting in touch with meaning, coming from our own sacred space, our heart space or whatever. So we relate more gently to other people. But Charles Eisenstein goes back to a very old concept, and it's called interbeing. So we're not just alone in our own spirit. It's very hard for me to like his book, Climate, a New Story, because he really criticized science as it is right now. But I got over that, and then I liked it because he brought in the concept of interbeing.
Very cool. Thank you. I haven't actually encountered his work before, so this will be some new reading for me.
Oh, he's great. Sacred Economics, I can recommend. And there's another book. I'm just trying to remember the title. I'll put it in chat.
More Beautiful World Our Hearts Know Is Possible. Is that it?
That's the one.
Yes.
Very cool. Thank you. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I didn't mind waiting because all the comments that were made were all wonderful. And actually,
thank you, Phil.
Actually leads very much to my comment. I'll start off by saying I was always curious when I was in high school what the science teachers would tell me, never ask the question why.
Yes.
And I would always think like, well, wait a minute, that isn't that the most important question? Okay, so that's interesting. And then now I understand better the difference between modernism and postmodernism. You know, I've been using the term modernism correctly in art because it seems to me art is actually postmodern in that sense. And I'll start off by saying, you know, like William Blake sort of began the whole romantic movement, which is about the movement of the spirit, you know. And so therefore, in a sense, 19th century art in many phases were very much related to 20th century art, except that its form was very different because it was based on the worn out thing of the old myths, except for landscape painting. You know, and landscape painting was a very, very inspiration to many of the 19th century artists. And I think I was always curious to the degree I know Merleau-Ponty that he sort of praised very much Cézanne as, I guess, the pinnacle of pictorial art. And like he doesn't mention so much Picasso. And we always think of Picasso as like the most important artist, and I still do, but nonetheless, that was a curious situation because Cézanne was about being in nature, but he was trying to make a synthesis between form and a relationship to nature, okay? And he actually arrived at what essentially was a form of cubism already by this natural process of understanding the relationship between nature and himself through the finding process. And what Picasso did was turn finding essentially into making, in the sense that now it is on the canvas that people, through the process of making, find new forms, okay? And that was a very important change because it became more synthetic. And what they were attacking was not the disagreement with nature, but in the sense to invent a new language to liberate the spirit, okay? So that was a little different. And that's why I mentioned the thing about the blank spots in Cézanne as misinterpreted as like he was introducing the nothingness into his painting. No, he just couldn't find, because like Beethoven, there were mysteries left, okay? So in that sense, it was interesting. And then let me do another thing. Is like when you go back and you look at Christianity, and I guess Judaism and Islam, there was the Garden of Eden, and in the Garden of Eden, there was two trees, the tree of knowledge and the tree of life, okay? We seem to be focusing on the fall and how Adam ate the apple. And of course, we put the bad guy as Eve. So we downgraded, like it wasn't his fault. It was Eve did it, made him eat it. But nonetheless, but nonetheless, forgetting about that part, we ate that thing. And I was in a Tao session about the Tao. And finally somebody asked, like, could you just simplify, like, what is the essence of what he was saying? And it says, well, it's ultimately about returning to nature. And I asked the question, which nature? The material nature or the nature of living things? Which is which reflects back to the Garden of Eden. I think it took us a long time to start to talking about the tree of life, which we have ignored. Mankind have ignored because they didn't eat the pear from the tree of life, right? Right. So we are finally getting to the point where like ecology is finally understanding there's a different structure within the tree of life than the tree of knowledge. One thing I'll criticize Kant about was his misuse of the word universal, right? It took me a long time to understand, like, what the hell? Universal to him meant what is already known, in a sense, right? I mean, laws are constructed by what is already known. Because I guess we can't make laws based on the unknown, like that anything goes, right? Like Wagner. And so therefore what's known, but there is something outside of the universal, the greater mystery of the greater universal that I was always confused by. But now that I understand his meaning of the universal, then he's saying the limited known place in which we could talk about, and what you can't talk about, I guess, it would be like you keep silent and not talk about it. No, we want to talk about that part. That's the problem. And I think that is an important thing, that we don't exclude the silent part. And the silent part, like I said, there's a real silent part which you can't talk about, which I suppose even the Tao tried to talk about it, except they say, well, what we said is not the Tao. Okay. But there is a in-between place of that, which is what you can't talk about, but you could point to, which is what the artists are talking about, right? And science is beginning approach, which is to, like music, this pathway to a higher knowledge, which we don't understand. We don't even understand ourselves because we don't understand it. We're not plugged into it. So I think Beethoven actually is very important. And I think Merleau-Ponty is plugged into Beethoven and plugged into Cézanne, right? And Cézanne is trying to walk that line between what we can't talk about and what we can talk about and give form to, and on the verge of being Cubism, but a more sort of like Cubism about living nature rather than a production nature, which Cubism is about, right? The inventiveness of, let's say, the Eiffel Tower, the inventiveness, these are real things in the world which we produce by that knowledge that we already have in the universe that we understand, but there are other parts that we don't understand, and we should have to at least try to get to that point. And I think poetry does a better job. That's all. So
Thank you, Phil.
Thank you very much.
You just kind of blew my mind there, because I'd never thought about the metaphor of the tree of life and the tree of knowledge as being a metaphor for gnosis and noesis. But now that you've said it, it actually fits in with that discussion we had a week or two ago about the alphabet and the goddess, right? The idea that the discovery of noesis changes the civilization and allows it to shift from a mythos culture to a logos culture, to become a hyper-Apollonian, noetic laws, noetic decision-making, leading to and/or reinforcing patriarchy, racism, colonization, and so forth, which all are natural consequences of the tendency to abstract the world, abstract ourselves, abstract other people. And the whole idea that maybe we should have taken a fruit from both trees, so we could have kept ourselves in balance and remembered that the living systems of the world, the ecosystems, have a different way of understanding themselves and each other, and a different way of organizing that is actually the thing that made noesis even possible in the first place. It's the more essential of the two trees to stay rooted into, so that we don't lose our way. That's cool, Phil. I'm never gonna read Genesis the same way. So thank you for that.
So can I just do a sidebar?
Please.
So this weekend, I went to the performing arts in town here, and I saw something which I thought you would like, Phil. It's called Lasting Impressions. And what they did is they had 100 classic masterworks from all the Impressionists, and they put them into a 3D LED production. So you are sitting in the audience, and when they had Van Gogh's irises, you felt like you were part of it. And they put movement to it with Impressionist music. There was Debu, and there was, who was singing Starry, Starry Night? The guy who sings American Pie. What's his name?
McLean.
McLean, yes. And it was very, very well done. It went on for about an hour and a half. And what it does, it took the paintings and put new technology to it. The production was called Lasting Impressions. And as you talked about Cézanne, it just flashed across my mind because I enjoyed it so much.
I hear that's an amazing
And
show.
there's nothing against the new technologies as long as we put it into the proper balance. I think that it's out of balance. That's a problem.
As long as we keep them as our servants and not
Yes.
our masters.
Oh, this was a servant, all right.
It sounds
Because I
great.
learned a lot from it, right?
It
And
sounds
they had the
interesting.
music of Debussy, Ravel, and it was just so very, very well done. And it even made a bigger impression on me because I just finished watching on Netflix the life story of Van Gogh, and he figured prominently in this 3D holographic experience.
Yeah, there's a Van Gogh exhibition. It might be the same one that's here in Seattle now, And I think I better go see it now after your review.
Yes, yes. Thank you for that. It's a sidebar, but I just wanted to mention it. It was very, very well done.
So I just want to point out at the bottom of the first page, he's responding to Joshua going, "Oh no, I didn't mean that Merleau-Ponty was sophistic, that he was a sophist. I meant he's thinking on a whole different level, that almost an heuristic level, an ability to see the infinite connections between things that's necessary to comprehend organic order." And when he says, maybe as close to Hegel as we could hope for, that's high praise indeed. I mean, he's telling you that Merleau-Ponty was either a huge influence on the development of Kenneth's own philosophy, or that, once Kenneth's philosophy had developed, he looked over, discovered Merleau-Ponty and said, "Hey, brother, fellow thinker," somebody who's finally working at the level of actual philosophy. The list of 20th century philosophers that Kenneth Smith respects as being, as at least playing in the adult field, who aren't just narrow specialists, is a very short list. So Bergson and Merleau-Ponty both deserve, a look from us if we want to understand Smith. That's basically what he's saying here. That's the subtext. And I have read some Bergson. I have more that I haven't read yet, but I haven't read any Merleau-Ponty yet. I've only read about Merleau-Ponty. So this is one of my blind spots I got to do something about in order to catch up a little.
Well, I also think where he goes farther down and he talks about Jacques Barzun and the House of the Intellect. I read a little bit about him, and I thought that was him trying to explain the meaning, the right brainness of what science ignores.
Yes, Jacques Barzun.
I love the next sentence right after that, Sharon. And I think it really speaks to how the extrinsic outside pressures that we've sort of given away we've sort of ceded our power to, how they treat our own interiority. And Kenneth says it's so great. I mean, quote, "The interiority of self of any creature is to this extrinsicalism merely what it has been conditioned to be or become by derivation from the effects of its external circumstances," so that it just regards what is this vital principle, vitalism, the interiority of the person, as just derivative. It's just something that, and we can adjust that and modulate that at our whim to suit our own consumeristic behavior, our own political ambition, or, however we want. We can fit that into any Procrustean bed we like. And I thought that was a really artful way of talking about how extrinsicalism treats the interiority of a person.
Yeah.
But one other thing too, I spend a lot of time on ethics committees, and I think this is probably a good representation of it, because you bring to the ethics committee and a very scientific occurrence, and then you try to resolve the issue through the internal mechanisms in the context of the culture in which we live. And that was most of the time not very productive.
Yeah. We're not well armed to, or prepared to deal with these things in our culture. We're taught to see a mechanistic world in which things can just be reorganized to suit ourselves, or to suit whoever has the money or power to have the right to exercise their Verstand, their spirit, their ego. And go ahead.
Yeah, well, not only that, but what could be inside of knowledge is already excluded and put in the outside, simply because the power structure. Yesterday, I was listening to a video while I was driving to an examination for an operation, and I was curious. I just happened to hear this woman partially. I mean, it was like it was cut off at some point, about what she termed as a sexy title, "Sex in the Sea," which is sort of interesting. She was talking no, no, she was talking about biological research about, for instance, one story she talked about was the parrotfish, which is very, very interesting. She said that parrotfish is like very interesting in the sense that there is a female who's much, much more larger than the male. And the males were, in a sense, because of her size and dominance, are reduced to actually remaining in a juvenile state. And so she would choose like whatever male she picks and invite him to be with her. They're together for a while because he was the chosen one in a sense, right? And they would finally engage in what we would call sex, but it's different for reproduction. And then what would happen is that eventually that couple, the female, ended up, I guess, laying eggs and whatever and dying. Okay, she gets old. And then the chosen male grows and becomes a female. So they have a way of becoming the opposite sex. And that she would then swim around and choose one of the juveniles to become mature, and the whole thing goes over. And she said, what we don't understand when we do this, even if we to our own benefit, is that when we go fishing, of course, we want to catch the biggest one. And so therefore, the big females get caught, okay? And when you do enough of this, it disrupts the whole reproduction cycle, because now there's a bunch of juvenile males running around who are unable to transfer themselves into the dominant female, and the cycle is completely busted, okay? She talked about a lobster that was very interesting. The lobster was like, this one particular lobster was like, the male would be very dominant and the female smaller. And when it's time to come for mating, okay, the most proper time when she's about to molt, okay, and she was about to become the most, how should I say, vulnerable state. And they would be together. The reason why they would be together, by the way, is that she has this tactic of, let's say, she calls it peeing on the male in the right way over several days and become an aphrodisiac. And he just couldn't help himself. And so they would then come into this private cave or whatever they have, and they would do their thing. And in the most vulnerable moment, she would actually molt, and she would become this sort of almost like a blob. She doesn't have almost any structure. And he would come and cradle her, and together, and of course, disperse, I guess, the sperm or whatever is necessary. And then he would, I guess, carry away the eggs. And then she would then, at that point, and that was, I guess, the ultimate one night stand. And then he would leave, and then she would then begin to grow back her shell, no longer soft. And so that would carry on. So when you disrupt that, and then she finally concluded with a different thing, I missed some other parts, a thing where, like, well, essentially a bunch of fish would become, essentially have a wild sex party, particularly in the moon, full moon cycle, okay? And they will all be together swimming, and of course the males would release their sperm in a kind of group orgy. And then what would happen is that then that would happen, and the female would swim around. Of course, they'd be fertilized, the eggs. And of course, if you are strictly thinking in terms of efficient fishing, oh, that is the perfect spot to catch this group, because there's abundance of fish. But if you don't watch out, then essentially you're going to wipe out these sex parties, and the whole thing will collapse. And so we just simply don't understand the situation, even if we're thinking in terms of our own self-benefit, that in a sense, if you disrupt the cycle that's within nature itself, then in a sense, even in just selfishness, you got to watch out that other species have different way of coping with things than we think. And so therefore, if you don't understand at least the cycle and not disrupt these sex orgies and parties, and then in a sense, it's no longer going to work. And that's exactly what's happening. And so the fisheries are now finally begin to understand that. So that's kind of interesting how she talks about that there is something completely different in the way nature organizes than certainly our money cycles operate.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. That noesis is very well suited to pick up a block and stack it on top of another block, but it is not very well suited to understand when you can't do that. You know, it's like noesis is great at comprehending the banana, but terrible at understanding the banana ecosystem. You need gnosis to be able to reach into the infinite and the subtle in order to see what long-term consequences are. And that's why so many brilliant, beautiful plans are, you know, thrown down by the law of unintended consequences. We did this thing and it should have worked, but now we have rabbits all over Australia. How the hell did that happen? It's like, you know, it's just, noesis is constantly surprised by and then later trying to suppress and forget that it ever happened. How many of its brilliant plans have turned out to be Wile E. Coyote in a nutshell. Honestly, Roadrunner
Talk about Roadrunner. I got Roadrunner.
It's deeply insightful about the limitations of noesis. You can just imagine the coyote as Verstand personified, and you won't go far wrong in understanding any of these cartoons. So, you know, in the essay on the page you guys were just on, I guess this is the second page. He's got this interesting turn of phrase where he talks about vitalism attempted to reconnect with the original traditions in which Western culture was rooted. And before I go on, I just want to, you know, connect that to he's talking about indigeneity predating colonizer culture. That in part of what defines indigenous cultures is their capacity for and attachment to gnosis and to understanding the infinite and subtle weave that we're in a larger part of something, that we're not detachable. And so vitalism was attempting to basically break with thousands of years of Western colonizer tradition and reach down underneath to say, who did we used to be? How did we used to see the world? What have we lost? And he says, and to rise above the cloying and intellectually self-prepossessed mechanistic worldview that is the placenta for modern science and capitalism.
Well, one of my highlights.
Yeah, you highlighted that one.
What page is that? Page is that?
That's the very second page of the essay, right near the top in the great big fat paragraph. Same paragraph where he mentions creative evolution and the phenomenon of life. It's just before that.
Okay.
So he's saying we could read Henri Bergson's Creative Evolution, which I've got downstairs but haven't read yet, and get some sense of this idea that vitalism is trying to reach underneath the mechanistic worldview and try to get back to how things, to understand what we used to understand but now can't. Likewise, Hans Jonas's The Phenomenon of Life, I've read a couple of essays out of, and it is an attempt to explain life using modern language but the archaic Greek worldview. So a more indigenous description of life, but using modern words. It's interesting. And specifically the challenges that what Phil's talking about, what the challenges that ecosystems present to modernistic Verstand ways of knowing. And it's worth noting that that title, The Phenomenon of Life, was also used by Christopher Alexander for the first book in his 4-volume series, The Nature of Order. Volume 1 is The Phenomenon of Life. So he's trying to bring to architecture that vitalist philosophy and insight that Hans Jonas is writing about and Bergson's writing about and Merleau-Ponty and Kenneth Smith and so on. So there's all these connections. There's all these cross-disciplinary connections, especially when you get into vitalism. And part of the reason for that is that vitalism, because it's trying to understand organic order, is forced to grapple regularly with the infinite and the subtle and the interconnected. And it forces you to break down barriers in your search for the truth. Somebody popped their hand up just for a second right before Dave.
It was Dave, I just wanted to say that I was very impressed with the way he addressed Darwinism, because Darwinism is such a foundational context for heredity. And when he talked about the beaches of the beaks of the finches on the Galapagos Islands, right? I was very struck because I couldn't see an intrinsic concept there. It was the way these beaches, the finch's beak evolved to meet what was the food that was available in the environment over a period of time. And so he used it, and yes, it was an entirely extrinsic mechanism, right?
Right.
And so I struggled to see where the intrinsic nature of that exercise would have added anything to it.
I can tell you where.
Where?
This is one of my favorite things. I love that stuff he wrote about that. But why didn't tortoises in the Galapagos Islands evolve beaks? Why didn't worms evolve beaks? Why didn't any of the other things that could have had access to the same resources evolve beaks? Why was it the finches whose beaks changed? It's because the finches were already on that path of evolution, and within their DNA and their lifeways, they were predisposed to support certain kinds of evolution instead of others, just like others were predisposed not to evolve in that direction. One of my favorite mysteries about the dinosaurs is if you compare dinosaurs as a class of vertebrate to any other class of vertebrate, they have an astonishing morphological variability. The number of shapes that dinosaurs take over the course of their existence, we take it for granted, right? As we're kids when we're first exposed to how wildly different they look from each other. But if you just put away everything you've ever learned in your life and stand back, look at other classes of vertebrates, and then come back and look at dinosaurs again, the question just leaps out of the page. How could they change that much physically? I mean, they became birds. Birds are dinosaurs, right? They literally changed the outside of their bodies from head to toe and are still the same class of vertebrate. How could they do it? Mammals can't do that. I mean, we could have more fur or less fur, but other than the one exception of scales, hardly, we don't like suddenly develop a whole bunch of other kinds of we don't develop amphibian skin. We don't develop feathers. We don't do any of those things. We can't. It is not in our intrinsic nature to vary in those ways. It's not within reach for us, but it was within reach for the dinosaurs because of their intrinsic nature. They could evolve those morphological forms. And the finches, thus, part of the strategy for birds is the capacity to radically change this whole area of their face in a way that no mammal ever will. That's the
So therefore, it's species related, and is species related? Isn't that still external? Because the tortoises that are there, the iguanas that are there, the crabs that are there, I've never seen such brightly colored crabs anywhere else in the world, just in the Galapagos, right? And that was an adaptation to their environment too. Mm-hmm. So what I'm saying is, which is why this whole intrinsic thing kind of confused me a little bit, because it seemed to be species related. And when I think about intrinsic, I think about an internal modulating mechanism.
It is. This is one of the things that Darwin missed, but that modern evolutionary biologists are looking into, is the ways in which multicellular organisms are predisposed to evolve. We are not passively operated upon like clay. Evolution doesn't have any fingers. It's not actually molding us. Rather, we've developed genetic structures and RNA structures and hormone structures and protein structures such that we are at all times, when put under enough stress, prepared to radically alter, even in the course of a few generations. It was Stephen Gould, and I forget who his partner was, who developed the theory of punctuated equilibrium. That evolution isn't just a process of smooth, steady mutation over time, but instead it seems species stabilize for a while. And then over remarkably short periods of time, geologically speaking, they undergo radical transformations and then stabilize again. And how do you explain that stabilization versus revolutionary change quality? Well, since Gould's time, one of the dominant theories that's been emerging is that it is in our biological structure to either hold ourselves steady and stable when conditions are steady and stable, or to undergo rapid evolution, rapid morphological change. We're participating in it. It's not just happening to us. We're actually doing it. And that's not something that was part of Darwin's theory. He didn't have an explanation. He saw it as entirely extrinsic, which was the natural idiom of the 19th century, that nothing has any inherent meaning and these things all just happen.
And in the essay, I think Kenneth on page 93 makes a great point about why Darwin's theory is so alluring, because these abstractivist systems tend to have a circularity built in. And so he says, survival of the fittest. Well, that's a circular thing. Survival for what? I mean, you're fit for what? To survive, right? So there's a circularity built in there. And as Kenneth says, it's a vacuous value judgment that whatever is right. It's ex post facto. You're looking back. Just because this has happened, oh, it must have been survival of the fittest, right? Well, why are, it's circular. So that's why it's so alluring to fall into that scientific type of dogmatism that excludes the intrinsic.
Well, and the enormous intrinsic thing that's going on here, that in evolutionary biology, is why would a straight white cis male intellectual in 19th century Europe find it satisfying to imagine that whoever dominates must be the most fit? Well, because they were dominating Africa, they were dominating the Americas, they were dominating Asia, they were dominating Australia, and they wanted it to be not just that they were doing this unilaterally and it was unjust. They wanted it to be that white, straight, cis men were more evolved and sophisticated than people of color. And in the 19th century, they used to just say it straight up. They just flat out, we are more evolved. They would say people of color are the primitive versions of us. And we're better than they are, and that's why we deserve to have the things we have, because we are more fit. And there are places outside of his scientific essays where Darwin basically says that, and so was everybody around him at that time saying the same thing, because they were justifying themselves. So there is an intrinsic quality to the scientist himself, and why he finds compelling the arguments that he finds compelling, that goes unexamined when his belief system is so focused on the extrinsic. So he wants to think that the reason he reaches these conclusions is because he's uniquely objective and sees the truth. He doesn't want it to be because he's looking for a rationalization for slavery and genocide and conquering the world. Even though the science is good, the evolution, the breakthroughs on evolution were profound and important, and all those things, that can be true at the exact same time that he finds it intellectually and emotionally satisfying that survival of the fittest is the only reason.
That's probably why Kenneth chose the William Blake quote to end the essay: "As a man is, so he sees." Very Nietzschean type of concept.
Yeah, that quote is never far from Kenneth's mind.
Can I just ask a question here? Because I read Homo Sapiens by Yuval Harari. And one of the theories that he proposes in the book is that of all the Homo species, Homo sapiens survived because it was the only one with cognitive ability. Now, is that not the fittest? And because he had cognition, he could dominate. He or she could dominate. We used to think that. Go ahead.
We used to think that, but more and more evidence is coming out that Neanderthals, for example, were every bit as smart as we are. We used to think that they couldn't talk, and now we discover they can talk. We used to think they didn't do art. Now we're discovering they did do art. What's happening is that Homo sapiens is more recent than a lot of its fellow species, and so delicate craftsmanship survives better in the fossil record than older craftsmanship would have, even if it had been equally delicate. And so it's very hard to find Neanderthal art, but we're beginning to find it. The same thing is true of there was a I don't know if you followed for a while, maybe decades in the 20th century, we were sure Neanderthals couldn't speak other than grunting, making noises. And the way we proved it was based on the structure of the human voice box.
Mhm.
See, the way the human voice box is structured, it allows us to modulate the air in such a way that we can produce all these sounds, and that's why we're capable of speech. And we notice that if we look at the fossils and other remains from Neanderthals, they don't have those structures, so therefore they couldn't speak. And this was dogma. I believed it when I was a kid. I was totally. I mean, I've been an evolutionary fan since I was a since I learned to read. Yeah, but here's the thing. At the exact same time, every evolutionary biologist on the face of the planet was sure of this. Infants have a throat more like a Neanderthal throat than like a Homo sapiens adult throat. They grow into, the structure of the trachea and the voice box changes as they reach maturation to become like an adult human beings. And is it true that no infants or children can speak? Of course not. Every single parent in the history of the universe has always had the experience, right? That we know they can speak despite the fact that they have the same throat structure that Neanderthals had. And yet we were so pleased by the idea that we were uniquely advanced and that anybody different from us must be inferior to us, that we looked away from the everyday evidence that was all around us in our lives at every moment. We just didn't look at it in order to accept this idea that made us feel good about ourselves. And so that's the thing about cognition. The other species cognate. They think. They thought. They engaged. We can tell by the things they did that they were thinkers. But if you really don't want that to be the case, you can always find evidence to prove that we're the first ones to do it.
Mm.
When I was a kid, my dad was not just a radical atheist. He was also a behaviorist. He was into Skinner and the other behaviorists. And that was a disaster for those who lived through that period. But one of the things about Skinnerianism is how modern it is. The idea that people's inner lives don't matter at all and that you can entirely manipulate them through rewards and punishments is the pinnacle of an extrinsicalist approach to human beings. And it goes hand in hand with modernism's idea that just like resources and animals, human beings exist for us to exploit to do what we want to achieve for pragmatic reasons, right? So, of course, everybody seized on this idea that people don't have any inner life, or if they do, it doesn't matter. And the only thing that matters is how you program them, because it satisfied an extrinsicalist notion of the cosmos and the self. And yet, at the exact same time that was incredibly familiar, that everybody was buying into that idea, in their own lives, they had an inner life. And so did everybody around them. And they continued to see it everywhere that they looked. They just learned to suppress something that was everywhere in their life in order to adopt this Verstand idea that made sense to them scientifically. The 20th century is a rich mine for studying the ways in which people can look away from the evidence, even if the evidence is literally present in every second of their lives. They can still look away from it if it doesn't satisfy the schema that they've learned and memorized. It's the danger of Verstand, that Verstand can be convinced by anything that's internally self-consistent. And of the many, many things that are internally self-consistent, it will seize upon the ones that unconsciously please it and cherry pick the evidence to make it seem obviously true. Why did there have to be an argument over continental drift? Literally every child in the world who looked at a globe said, hey, these continents fit together. And they were told over and over and over, generation after generation, no, they don't. It's a coincidence. Look away from it. That's not true. Continents don't drift. Literally every child could see it. But every adult had learned to ignore the evidence. And
January 6th.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. It could be right in front of us. And yet still the power of Verstand can suppress anything into the background. So that's how it is with this, with evolution. It's what we're discovering is that evolution's far more complicated, and that it involves interactions between the species and the environment, in which the species is more than just a passive piece of clay being molded. And some species will evolve more than others will. And more specifically, every species has a different configuration of which parts of itself are ready to mold and morph, and which parts it can't mold or morph because they're the commitments that it has made architecturally inside of itself. Those parts can't change. Now, as human beings, we pride ourselves on being the most adaptable species that ever lived, just like we previously thought we were the smartest, and all the other things. And so we have this concept of a potentially infinite adaptability. This is how moderns paint Homo sapiens, right? We can adapt to anything. We'll fly through the stars, we'll live in space, we'll make spaceships, we'll live on Mars. We can do anything. This is basically just a scientized version of self-deification. The belief that we have no intrinsic nature that's binding upon us and that we can become anything we want to. The fantasies of uploading our consciousness into a computer and living an immortal virtual life are just another form of this idea that we have no constraints, we shouldn't have any limits, we should be able to be like gods and reinvent ourselves at every moment. This Protean myth, the myth of Proteus. I don't know if you guys know from Greek mythology. Proteus was an ancient sea god who polymorphed into things. He could change himself into anything. And one of the heroes, and I forget who it was, I can't remember if it was Jason or Theseus, had to get an answer out of Proteus. And the only way he could do it was to hang on to him no matter what he turned into. And Proteus goes through all these changes from one thing to another in an attempt to escape before he finally gives in and tells Jason or Odysseus the answer that he wanted. And this Kenneth Smith takes away as a metaphor for the way that the ego wants to imagine itself free of all constraints, free of all natural existence, since natural existence is about constraints and pathos, and that it can reinvent itself to become anything it wants to be. It dreams of being the god Proteus. So we as moderns, we imagine that we're infinitely adaptable, but nothing is infinitely adaptable. Everything is bound within complex webs of causality and dependency and obligation, whether we like it or not. And if we look at those things, then we can then we can learn what our scope of free will is. What are the things that we do have freedom in, and what are the things we don't? And we can be more effective in our lives. But as long as we're not willing to do that work, we find ourselves trapped in this myth of infinite adaptability, and that just sets us up for disaster. When sooner or later we pick a strategy that demands that we make a change that we're not actually capable of making. That's part of our architecture. I'm very excited about this. I definitely don't mean to run over anybody on this, but evolutionary biology has been like, they used to call me the dinosaur dictionary in school. I was just crazy for evolution.
Well, I have to step in and defend the biologist. What's his name again?
Darwin.
Darwin. I have to defend him at least.
Sure. Yeah, defend Darwin.
So I'll admit that maybe the subliminal part is repressed, so he does have this sort of subliminal racism. But compare him to like a Victorian hero, like Robinson Crusoe. He would not have seen the finches. He would immediately reconstruct the thing and colonize the thing. So at least he permitted some information to flow in. So I can't put that kind of blame on him to that degree. We all suffer from repression to a certain degree, okay? And it's up to us to, in a sense, unlock those and expose that to ourselves. But to what degree you can, it's difficult to say. But I would say that if I had my ruthers, I'd rather have him on, Easter Island or whatever is that? Is it Easter Island?
The Galapagos.
Galapagos, okay. Then Robinson Crusoe.
Oh yeah.
So you can't because just because he had a false start doesn't mean that he did not begin something that others could carry on and recorrect.
Yes.
Right? So therefore, I would, okay, let's not make him a hero, just a semi-hero, okay, to that degree. I'll agree with that.
Yeah, and I mean, go ahead.
Doesn't Darwin enable Robinson Crusoe? And
yeah, you're right.
Right?
You're right.
Whatever is right. Survival of the fittest. Hey.
Well, he was also a product of his time.
Yes.
And the data that he procured and interpreted was the art, was the science at the time.
Yeah, that's right. And I find the most interesting relationship to have with our heroes is to understand them to the point that we not only see their virtues, but we also see their vices. and we see both at the same time. They don't like, it's not that we want to tear them down off the pedestal, but that we don't want them to be on a pedestal alone. We want them to be a person that we can relate to and learn from, because the vices of great people teaches us a lot about our own vices. It gives us a greater ability to have sympathy and understanding for the fact that we too are imperfect. We too are full of flaws, and that, if we're lucky, maybe we can figure out how to spot them and work on them while we're still alive, and we can push the ball a little further down the court. Go ahead, Marianne. I see you got your hand up.
Yeah. So when we were talking about Darwin, I was thinking of the English and how they wanted to dominate everything. And I think you're right, that was a product of their thinking, and they applauded it. But underneath all that is the ability of us as social human beings to look for minds that are similar to our own, and how we duplicate whatever validates some kind of ego need in us to find that duplicating mind. And when we're talking about being able to evolve and adapt, I'm worried, like social media, all our likes and our dislikes, we are creating these pictures that affirm ourselves that may have no way of resolving conflict. And I'm thinking that this could be a flaw.
Yeah. The echo chamber effect is a menace, right? It's a menace, because the thing that there's a reason we have a bicameral mind. We need both the ability to recognize what's similar, but also the ability to create distinctions and separate ourselves from it. And neither one is the full answer. We have to be able to do both and modulate between them and use them both. And so there is this drive in us to want to find fellow travelers, kindred spirits, as Anne of Green Gables puts it. And for the development of Aristeia at all, for there to even be Aristoi, we have to be able to do that and seek out other people who will drive us to become better versions of ourselves. It's not possible to develop Aristoi without that. But at the exact same time, we also need to avoid becoming parochial, and we need to become cosmopolitan, which requires breaking out of our comfortable shells and our comfortable communities and being exposed to new things. It's like Phil says, the place we want to be is not in the city or out of the city, but at the gate where we can go both ways. We're like the cat that wants the door always open. It wants to come and go, but not just right now. Just leave it open, please. Architect Christopher Alexander talks about this. He says a mistake that a lot of architects make when they make spaces is they don't create enough transitional in-between places, because human beings love to be right on the edges between two things. Sitting on the edge of a cliff, eating your lunch, where safety's behind you, can get there anytime you want, but you've got this amazing view in front of you. It's an example. It's why do people want their chairs by the windows? Why do people like covered porches or little outdoor rooms? It's got a roof but no walls. So that sense of I can modulate back and forth between helps us come to life. So we feel that freedom to be able to shift modes then. Donald, go ahead.
We don't mean leave. Go ahead and leave. I mean,
no. I quit reading Stephen Jay Gould when he died, but up to then I'd read everything he had written, I think. But I like the way, in a sense, that he stood Darwin on his head, in that Darwin saw this, that the pressure of the environment drove evolution, and that caused the variation. And Gould, in Punctuated Equilibrium, but in actually study of a lot of fossils and stuff like that, is that when the environment is putting very little pressure on the organisms leading into it, then the organisms are free to play, explore. But when there's a lot of pressure, if you're surviving, you don't change a thing. I'm making it, I just keep making it. But when there's abundant resources, very few other species competing with you, well, I'm going to try growing a third arm or whatever. Or I'm one of these finches that's thoroughly modern and evolves my beak to be a hammer and then demands that the world become full of nails or something. And of course it fails, but never mind. We tend to do that with the world ourselves, is we have developed our abilities and then conform the world to them or demand that it do that. But Gould was a very, very interesting biologist. And if Rick, if you have some later writers in this field, I myself would like to read some more. And I'm going to have to go back and read Hans Jonas because it's been so long ago. I have the book. I know I read the book, but I can't recall what he said other than he tried to provide some permanence through the fact that neurons don't die to how do we get constancy in the flux, which is, I think, a question that Kenneth has to turn to because he's so Heraclitean. But if you're sort of ruthlessly Heraclitean, it's not that you can't step into the same river twice. You can't step into it once. There's no one to step. There is no river. There is no spoon. Where do you get the knowing being or the acting being to move in the world?
Right.
I'm going to shut up.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because, Gould, one of the things that Gould talks about, that he emphasizes, that Darwin talks about but didn't emphasize as much, is the way that there's no such thing as perfectly fit, because during your periods of stability, a species can optimize itself to become perfectly fit in some ways. But if every member of that species is perfectly fit to those conditions, then when you leave the period of stability and enter a period of change, that species will go extinct. So the evolution doesn't happen at the individual level. So if they're all the same, then they all have the same weakness under the new system and they all die out. That what makes rapid evolution possible is that nature abhors a monoculture. And so instead, any given population is constantly diversifying itself, even though the diverse experiments it's generating are less well fit for the current circumstances. It creates a bell curve of possibilities around itself, a halo of subpopulations who are eccentric for the current circumstances, not eccentric enough to die out, but eccentric enough not to thrive if it weren't for the rest of their population helping them along. But then when circumstances change, it's the mainstream of the bell curve that dies out. And it's the weirdos who, because they've explored the field of possibilities, some of them are going to turn out to have luckily hit the jackpot when it comes to the new circumstances. And they become the founders of the new population. And that's how evolution works. And so this runs in contrariety to the 19th century appropriation of survival of the fittest to try to interpret it as straight white cis European men are the best because we own everything and we must have done that because we're the best. And so anybody who's not us is inferior. It's like, well, that's not what nature says. Nature says we should have an incredible variety. We should have if we want to evolve, when circumstances change, we have to have diversity. We have to support and reward diversity because it's our only chance to evolve. It's not perfect fitness that drives evolution. It's the other way around. Diversity drives the creation of the possibilities somewhere in which we hope to find the next population when our circumstances change. Gould did a better job, I think, than Darwin of talking about that aspect of evolution. And that's the aspect that comes closer to what makes a difference in our individual lives. It's like, yeah, we shouldn't be running around trying to exterminate everybody inferior. We should be running around trying to encourage diversity so that we've got a lot of possibilities to tide us over the next time things change.
And if you value the intrinsic worth, there's no way you would ever even conceive of exterminating another, right?
Exactly, because people aren't their abstractions. The abstractions are just a ephemera.
Well,
What's that, Sharon?
doesn't the intrinsic worth, if it's valued, there is no implied inferiority from that.
Right. It's the extrinsicalities that are all finite enough that they allow us to make these prejudicial, bigoted value judgments. And the things that people are prejudiced about each other are always so shockingly childish. It's like, oh, your skin color's the wrong hue. Oh, you're attracted to the wrong gender. Oh, the list is ridiculous. Whereas the things that actually make a difference in the world are these complex internal intrinsic structures of the mind. Do you have a value system that allows you to harmonize with the larger world and with other people or not? That's not something you can just point to on the outside of somebody and say, oh, you've got this mark on your forehead, so I should do you in.
Well,
Go ahead.
And yet the answer, as Kenneth Smith says, is not to flatten all hierarchies. I love that he does this, but to develop a more, as he says, connoisseurial power of discrimination as to better and worse, so that when you become unmoored and find yourself in a group that is extinguishing and exterminating, you could say, hey, hang on, this is not as good as a harmonizing worldview. It is better to be recognizing everyone's intrinsic worth. There is a hierarchy.
Right. I'm just never going to know as much about anesthesiology as Sharon is. Just never. It's never going to happen. And that's a good thing. I shouldn't be trying to flatten us all so we all know exactly the same trivial amount,
Exactly.
And it's hierarchies are a good thing when they're natural authority instead of artificial coercion. When they're based on the actual differences among us. We should treat each other well, not because we're equal, but because we intrinsically deserve to treat each other well and to be treated well, even though we are diverse, because we are diverse. And that's I think that gets lost a lot in pop culture versions of civil rights. Sometimes we overemphasize equality in such a way that it suggests that the conservative argument that unless we're all identical, we don't deserve dignity might be true, right? It should be, yeah. Anyway, I'm with you, Marianne, and then Phil.
Okay, so I want to jump in here and say that we have mirror neurons.
Yes.
It is evolutionary. One of the pinnacles of our civilization is our mirror neurons, and Darwin would have hated that. I think we can become compassionate and we can value not just the white male thing, but jump out of these boxes that we create for ourselves. It's more than a value system. I think that we, as evolutionary, we need to start valuing some of the complexities in our mind that takes us out of these kind of Darwinian things. And even rats will share their food. When one rat is feeling pain, they will also feel the pain. There is a presumption here, and it's just not true.
That's right. Empathy. We evolved not just to compete with each other, but to cooperate with each other. And you see it partly in empathy and mirror neurons. You also see it in a subject I was having a discussion with in my martial arts community about authority. Hannah Arendt's writing about authority and between past and future, where she makes the distinction between an authoritarian form of authority that isn't any authority at all. It's just coercion based on abstractions and power. Versus and by the way, that authority of authoritarian regimes, the way you know it's not an authority is that they have to demand it and try to enforce it with force and with fear. They try to get you to fear them. But fear is not respect. And the thing that the relationship that gets created through that fear is not a relationship of, it's not a true relationship of authority. In the martial arts community, if I'm trying to learn how to use a tonfa, and I go down to the dojo and I know how to do one or two little things, but I know that I don't really know what I'm doing. And a sensei says, oh, I would love to teach you Tonfa. Here's maybe the next thing that I could show you. And he does a kata, and you just stand there in awe because you can't do any of that. You see how much better it is than what you have. And you also see that if you studied under them, you could learn to do that too. And that's how they learned it. It's not like an infinite difference between you, but it's a measurable, profound difference that both evokes wonder and also the desire to imitate, the desire to follow, the desire to incorporate that into your life, to become a part of its life. It bonds you together into an unequal relationship that nevertheless is based on respect, right? And natural authority has less to do with fear and coercion and more to do with love and wonder and you know, that being drawn out of your limitations to seeing the larger world that you could dilate into. And that gets lost in the modern world, right? Police forces should be doing that, but they don't, right? Government officials should be doing that, but they don't. All our hierarchies should be based on natural authority, but they aren't. And once you see, if you're lucky enough in your own life to be around people who are really great at something and who are also nurturers who like to teach and to train up the next generation, then you get to experience natural authority with such clarity that you can then turn and look at our political and economic systems and go, that's not authority. That's the other thing. And that sucks. And we should do the world differently. And so I'm lucky because I get it not only in martial arts, which I've been doing since I'm a little kid, but in the medical software community, where we're basically kissing cousins with the medical community who we talk to every day. And in the medical community, that's the norm for how you train the next generation. You bring them in, you mentor them, you gradually give them more responsibility. And, you know, the first time a surgery student who dreams of being a brain surgeon gets to stand and observe while, you know, a world-class brain surgeon saves somebody's life by cutting out a tumor and the patient wakes up and hasn't lost any function because they did it right. And what the student feels at that moment is genuine respect for genuine natural authorities. Like, oh, that's who I wish I could. I want to be that. I want to do that. I want to understand that. And you have it, you know? So again, that comes back to what you're saying. There are these ways in which we are evolved. You know, that thing that we can do, it's not an accident. We are evolved that way to recognize excellence and be drawn towards it and to want to nurture the next generation that wants to excel. There's something in us socially that knits us together around the desire to improve and to help others improve. That's right there with empathy as far as another incredibly powerful organizational part intrinsically of our nature, but that modernism, although it exploits it frequently, doesn't actually ever want to let it have its way with us, even though it should. It'd be a better world if that was how things were governed. I think Phil and then Ginny, right?
Yeah. This thing about at what point does it become the hierarchy becomes oppressive and to what degree it creates harmony is interesting. I mean, I love basketball because it does seem to have kind of a harmony because it has a hierarchy, but the hierarchy is working cooperatively. I don't like football as much because it seems very corporate. Like you have a real set hierarchy, like it almost like a machine, like military or corporate structure in which you play your small part for the whole, which is sort of interesting. And this leads me to this thing I think I talked about in one of the earlier sessions about Herbie Hancock when he was playing, you know, and he gave a lecture about it, that he was playing at some point in which he was essentially playing the same thing and he thought that was beautiful and wonderful, except nobody really responded to it. And finally, and he knew there was something wrong, but he couldn't figure it out because he thought everything was fine. And then finally, Miles Davis came to him and said, the problem is you got to leave out the butter notes. Because he said it in a very mysterious way, okay? What the hell does that mean? And so he finally decided, well, what he needed to do is leave out the stereotypical notes, the major notes. And when he left it out, he realized it opened up all the other notes that had been suppressed. And it seemed like he suddenly found a new dynamics in his music. And actually, at first, he said, I thought it was awful. He actually said, I thought it was awful, but the audience loved it. His fellow musicians started complimenting him. And then he finally realized, yeah, this is just something new that is strange to me, but it actually is very liberating, because all these other notes that he has suppressed by leaving it out, is now suddenly they receive a kind of prominence, a new harmony that he didn't realize that it was there because it was suppressed. So that was interesting, that in a sense, he figured out that it wasn't really so much a mystery. It was a mystery he had to figure out, but it was just something that he was blind to because he was so familiar with the other thing, like the dominant dinosaur, and evolution and all that, that finally he was able to allow that to happen. So that was interesting how Miles Davis approached it. Instead of telling him what the answer was, he sort of hinted at what the thing was, but he had to discover it in himself. He had to discover the harmony himself. And his fellow musician loved it because now they could play. Right, and this brings me to one of my favorite pianists, Red Garland. And I was talking to some pretty good musicians, jazz musicians, who were expert pianists themselves. And I said, I liked him because the way he plays, he had a trio of his own, which he was a leader in, but particularly when he played with other prominent musicians as well, because his group would play with some other ones, make a quartet, a quintet. What I love about him is like when he almost doesn't play, which is a very interesting thing, because what he does is that he will sneak in a chord here, a few notes there, another chord there, and silence here, and so forth. And he would, in his sneaking in these notes, complemented all the other and elevated their playing. So it's as if he was as silent as he could and contributed to the harmony. And yet everybody knew that he was a great musician because of that, because he made the whole so much better by not standing in the spotlight all the time. So that was very, very interesting. So, so I kind of think that it's important to understand that don't always stand in the spotlight, because other people could also play and add to a greater harmony. That's right. Which is a difficult thing for some of us, including myself, to remain silent.
I see what you did there.
And if Miles had told him, it would have been an extrinsic suggestion, but instead he allowed him to find the intrinsic worth of his advice.
Right.
So, Jenny's talking next.
Yeah, Jenny, are you ready to go?
Oh, just going back to a couple of conversations ago, what you said, Rick, about something that it's exactly like do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Not because God said so or because the religion dictates that, but when you really think about it, whoever wrote that in the Bible, or is that part of the 10 Commandments? I'm not quite sure. It just makes sense, it just makes sense for the human race to live that way. You do not, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, right? It's logical. It just makes it's a sensible thing to be doing. So what is that part of 10 Commandments? I'm not sure.
No, it's New Testament.
It's the New Testament. Jesus said
it's in the New Testament. Okay.
Yeah.
So what they were just being is just whoever wrote it, they were just being sensible, right? I don't know.
Yeah.
I've been thinking, without being religious, I've been thinking that all along, all my life. I said, yeah, it makes perfect sense, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, right? Be nice to other people.
Yeah.
creates a harmonious environment, right?
Yeah, what's interesting about that particular formulation is the way that it causes you to think beyond your immediate goals, right? Because it makes you think about not just how does it affect you, but how does it affect other people as well, and therefore how does it affect the whole community that you're trying to create together? Which
Right.
is interesting, because usually when people are trying to describe ethical ideas for how to proceed, they often do it in terms of specific things you should or shouldn't do, and in doing that, they're being formulaic, right? They're like there's a recipe for goodness, but the formulation that says we got to think about the effect you have on other people doesn't let you do that. It's an infinitizing statement instead of a finitizing statement. It's not, I get to be good as long as I do X, Y, and Z and I don't do A, B, and C. It's instead, I always have to be ethically awake and ethically watching and thinking and judging and tasting and trying to evaluate whether I'm satisfying this or not. And so it wakes you up to a more ethical mode of life because of its refusal to give an easy answer. Just tell me the answer. What's the answer? I want to do that one thing. It's one of the better.
So you wonder if that kind of idea was not written down as in New Testament or whatever. What do you think if people were to just have no written documents to adhere to or to follow? What percentage of human race would naturally have behaved that way? And what percentage of people would naturally be aggressive and possessive and greedy? I just wonder, it sort of goes back to, are we naturally born evil or are we naturally born good? Right?
Yeah, Sharon raised that question a few months ago, didn't she? So,
did she?
Yeah, you can see in the chat, Marianne cites Confucius: "Do not impose on others what you do not wish for yourself." And Rabbi Hillel had done a similar statement before Jesus. It is a formulation, some flavor of which any sufficiently thoughtful civilization will discover, as long as they have not suppressed Gnostic intelligence in themselves and their population. Gnosis will sooner or later find this because it's such a potent formulation. It has reach, ethical reach. Like the dolphin and the ichthyosaurus and the tuna, why do they all have the same shape even though they all started in different places? Because it's there in nature to be found, right? If you're under these forces and trying to live this life, you will discover this body shape and this way of life, because it's how you solve these problems. And that's how it is with ethics. With all the deep principles of the world, they're not things that we impose from our minds onto the world. They're things that are already immanent in the world, but subtle, waiting for us to notice them and figure out how to think and talk about them, like this. That's a good example. The infinite ethics versus finite ethics.
And infinite ethics versus finite ethics.
Yes.
Wow, that's a new term. By the way, what was in the news this morning? I don't know if you guys heard, but did you hear about this man who was swallowed up by a whale, and then
Yes, I saw that.
and the whale spit him out after how many seconds? Or
30 seconds.
Was it 30 seconds? And maybe the whale said, "Oh, it doesn't taste very good, this human being," right? That was pretty cute.
I missed that. I'll have to look that up.
The story was he got caught up the whale was doing a fishnet, and he got caught up in that fishnet. And then this goes back to the Bible again, Jonah and the whale.
Right.
Jonah and the city of Nineveh, I think.
Yes.
When I saw that, I chuckled. I said, "There you go."
The whale's like, "Hang on, you're not a fish. Get out of here. What are you doing in here?"
You don't taste like fish. You taste yuck.
More crunchy.
A little more crunchy.
One of the interesting things. Can I speak now? May I?
Sure.
One of the interesting things I find is something that I call the plurality of religion. So that basic concept do unto others as you would have them do unto you. I think it runs through all the scriptural texts.
Yeah.
I think you can find it in Hinduism, you can find it in Judaism, because it's what we call empathy and compassion if you dress it up in New Age neutral terms. It's just that basic concept. And I think, and you can correct me on this, I think the Greeks and earlier civilizations, they all had that operative concept also, because it's the way people get together and try to survive, try to get along, actually.
And
So go ahead.
What you're describing, C.S. Lewis writes about in his book, The Abolition of Man, in which he asserts the idea that any sufficiently mature religion will hit upon a lot of the same core ethical precepts. And in the back, he calls that the Tao. He tries to redefine the word Tao, and he says the Tao is this ethical system waiting to be discovered by religions that they can capture to some imperfect degree, and that what you should be striving for in your own life is not to, in a fundamentalist way, do exactly what one religion says, but more specifically to find the deeper Tao that underlies all these religions and align yourself with that. And then he tries to list some of it in the back. So that was the first time I ever ran into the Confucius quote, Marianne, was in the back of Abolition of Man, alongside Jesus' quote and Hillel's quote and a bunch of others. This idea that people will independently discover these things because they're not just arbitrary inventions of human beings. They're actually in the world waiting for us to notice them, these principles. Go ahead, Sharon.
So having said that, when Phil was doing the critique, the grand critique of the essay, he said that Kenneth Smith says some things that were questionable. And so I want to bring up the paragraph where he talked about the Muslim car driver and the dead bird. I found that a little disturbing. And then over the page, he went on to say, the way when our follies and delusions make us wander from the path, we can find our way back in the direction of true rationality, true value, true religion. Darwinism, like Islam, is the triumph of indifferentiation or radicalized abstractivism, the equivalent of Banausic logics, A equal A, and A is not A, a night in which all cows are black, as Hegel described Schelling's metaphysical monism. Now, I read that sentence a couple of times, like 4 or 5 times. And the prelude to it about the cab driver and the pigeon I didn't like. And then I want you to kind of elaborate on his relationship between Darwinism, like Islam, is the triumph of indifferentiation.
Yeah, it's complicated here by the fact that he wasn't precise. He should have been more precise. He's not talking about Islam as a whole. He's talking about a particular cultural thread within Islam based on the I don't know if you've heard the phrase inshallah. If Allah wills it.
God willing, right?
God willing, right? It will work out the way that it works out if that's the way that God wants it to work out. And that specifically is the thing he's talking about, not Islam as a whole.
Okay.
That's what he means by Allah wanted that bird dead. It's like if it happened, it must have been the way that God wanted it. And what he's wrestling with here is religions that are based on omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent gods have a problem, and the problem is the problem of evil. If how could there and Voltaire writes about this extensively in his essay about the Lisbon earthquake. It's like if terrible things happen and God had the power to prevent them and the knowledge that they were going to happen, but he didn't, then he must have wanted it that way. But if he wanted it that way, then how can he be all good and still want things to be an evil way? And people try to get out of that with the little escape clause of saying, well, God moves in mysterious ways, or he has a grand plan, but stupid mortals, we couldn't understand it. All those things are attempts to sort of weasel God out of responsibility for the terrible things that happen, that by defining God the way that they have now made God responsible for. And so the only way out of what would otherwise become a religious crisis, if you follow that thinking to its logical conclusion, is you need a thought-ending escape clause. thought ending escape. Thought ending is the phrase that people use for kind of cliches that get repeated over and over that allow us to stop thinking and stop asking questions. Like when the 2-year-old is asking you why, you start to hit upon patterns of answers that give you a way to stop the questioning. Because I said so is an example of one of those thought terminating cliches. But there's a lot of them. And a lot of them are more sophisticated so that they look like answers when they're actually just designed to stop the questioning. And inshallah is one of those. Inshallah is a way of saying, yes, there is a problem of evil if we have an omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, all good God, and yet evil things happen. How do we reconcile the two? And the way we answer that is just don't ask that question. Let's stop talking about that anytime now. That would be nice because we don't like where this goes. And so what he's talking about here is that leads to a kind of indifferentness about the world. Things that if we were not defeating our curiosity and engagement, we might actually intervene to do something about. If instead it becomes a habit for us to engage in thought-terminating cliches, it will make us disengage from the things we ought to be changing. For example, that's how privilege operates inside of privileged people. Bad things happen to marginalized people, and they want to feel proud of their country and proud of themselves. But if they think it through, they're going to get some uncomfortable feelings about themselves and their lives and their country. So they say, well, there's always poor people. Oh, there's always suffering. That black man must have done something wrong that we just don't know about, and that's why he was killed. He must have actually been a bad guy. There's all these thought-terminating cliches designed to keep us from pursuing the question and engaging with the situation. So when he's comparing Darwinianism to Islam, he's not actually comparing it to Islam. He's comparing it to inshallah, to the resignation, the thought terminating cliche. And what he's comparing in Darwinism is he's comparing the idea of the fittest specifically. The idea that survival of the fittest actually explains anything is like the idea that inshallah explains anything.
Okay.
They both actually dodge the most potent questions that would get us engaged with the situation. And an example of that that he doesn't cite here, but that he talks about in other places is pragmatism. The US prides itself on being philosophically pragmatic. In the 20th century, our philosophers often presented themselves in opposition to European existentialism as being a pragmatic philosophy in America, that we're focused on getting things done. We're focused on what works, right? You hear people talk about that a lot. I don't study philosophy because it's not practical. I'm a practical person. I want pragmatic things. And the problem with that is that pragmatism is presenting itself as a philosophy or an alternative to philosophy, when what it actually is a thought terminating cliche. Because pragmatism says, oh, I'm not going to try to tell you right or wrong. I'm just focused on how to do the things that I want to do, how to be successful, how to be efficient, how to be effective. And the problem is, the whole point of philosophy is, well, the thing that needs to be questioned is what you want to do, Mr. Hitler. I really shouldn't be focusing on pragmatism. I should be with you. I should be focusing on, is it really right to put Jews in concentration camps? If I instead disengage from that and say, well, I'm just going to focus on the practical questions, like how to get more train cars per day in here and how to get the ovens to run more often and so forth, then I'm completely evading the most important question before me, which is, should any of this even be happening? Are my desires warped? Should I, all the questions that need to be asked, pragmatism suppresses them and says, don't worry your pretty little head about, whether I deserve to have an American empire that straddles the entire planet. Let's just talk about how to make it work successfully. Let's talk about how to make bigger bombs and more successful PR campaigns and propaganda. There is this way in which pragmatism dodges all the questions that matter in exactly that thought terminating cliche way that he's saying survival of the fittest dodges all the questions that matter, and inshallah dodges all the questions that matter.
And indeed, any system that claims to be universal is in essence a thought terminating cliche. Right. And embedded in that paragraph you just cited, Sharon, he says a theology that explains everything and justifies everything explains and justifies nothing.
Right.
So embedded in that is a critique of any system that claims to be universal.
That's right. And this is that's right on the money, Dave. And specifically, this is the Hegelian bad infinite of Verstand, where it becomes a universal at the price of becoming abstract. An abstract universal is how Verstand reasons. I can think about the whole world all at once and all the 7 billion people in it because I've erased everything about them that matters and turned them into a little outline that I call people. It's like, yeah, but the important parts are what you've erased from this picture. Your universality has come at the price of the truth. You're now in untruth because you're in abstraction. But that's how Verstand works. It only wants to focus on the things that is abstracted out so that it can universalize and apply them to everything. The thing that we're struggling to achieve to grow beyond Verstand, Vernunft, requires what Hegel calls the concrete universal, where when you talk about everything at once, you can't do it in an abstract way because that's not the way nature works. You have to talk about it in a concrete way in which every different place that the abstraction applies to, it manifests differently and appropriately to that circumstance. Just like the principle of life manifests differently in every single living cell in the world. It's everywhere, it's universal, but it's not abstract, it's concrete, it's detailed and fitted into its context. So that's the thing about universality under Hegelian schemas, is that there's two different forms of it. And what kills us about the theology that explains everything and justifies everything is that it does so by providing what it claims to be universal answers. Whereas what we actually see in true archai is that they achieve universality at the price of not being able to give us pat answers. Right? When we say treat others the way that you want to be treated, what we're saying is there isn't an easy answer. It's going to be in every different situation. It's infinite. It applies everywhere, but it has to be concretized before it actually becomes justice. And in the course of becoming concretized, we then apply it only to the one specific situation that we're trying to resolve it in.
That implied universality in religions, I think, operates against it, operates as a downfall. That's
Yes.
where we make non-believers.
Yes.
And
Right.
if you
Keep going.
And if you listen to atheists and agnostics,
Yeah.
This is one of the big arguments that they used. There is not a universal answer for everything. There's
Right.
good, there's evil, there are bad things, there are good things, and that's just life. And our challenge is, how do we deal with it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, these things are really hard to think and talk about. And it is in the nature of Vernunft and in the nature of Aristoi that they can rarely give you a pat, easy, confident answer. Because translating from the concrete circumstances we're in into the realm of the infinite, but in a concretizing way to avoid the traps of Verstand, is really hard to do. It's hard every time you do it. And in fact, if it's not hard when you're doing it, you probably aren't doing Vernunft at all. You're probably slipped into Verstand, because easy answers only come from Verstand. Yeah, easy universal answers only come from Verstand. Only hard infinitizing answers come out of Vernunft.
Rick, just quick question, Rick. Could you explain your definition of Verstand, please?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, Verstand is the naive form of noesis. It's when we're thinking in an intellectualized, educated, abstracting, systematized, logical, rational way that depends upon abstracting away most of the details that make life hard to think about. So instead of talking about the people you work with as human beings, you talk about them as human resources who produce so much productivity and generate so much money. Or instead of talking about the complexities of an ecosystem, you talk about it in terms of metric tons of lumber, as though there were nothing else there. Verstand thrives on, if we can abstract things enough, then logic works and we can start doing calculations and spreadsheets and reason and write programs. But the problem is the real world, everything's more complicated than that. And that's where Verstand gets its power, by ignoring all the complications and pretending that none of that matters.
Being for itself, you said, right?
Being for itself. Verstand is the thought form of the ego when it wants to manipulate the world. It does so by pretending that the things it's ignoring don't matter. Ceteris paribus, all else being equal. And so it says,
Diagrams.
I should be able to do this thing because I've defined the situation in such a way that all the people I'm trampling they're not actually people. They don't actually have rights. And therefore it's okay.
It reminds me of somebody who was in a political office until recently.
It does.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I believe his name starts with letter T.
I think one, living in a market economy, it's easy to see Verstand in operation all around us all the time.
Yes.
We all see the downfalls that come when we try to reduce things to money and say that that's the only part that matters. But that kind of thinking is exactly what Verstand wants to do.
I see.
It's
well,
to
thank you.
simplify
Thank you
things.
for that.
Donald, you've had your hand up for a while.
And at my age, that's quite an accomplishment.
He's saying there's a hazard here if I don't call on you soon enough.
No.
Oh,
No,
God.
but I will enter into a conversation I overheard decades ago with our mentor, Kenneth.
Uh-oh.
Somebody in his presence said, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you."
Oh, here we go.
And he said, what the height of presumptuousness that is.
Yes.
That you would begin to treat me as you treat yourself. We are nothing alike.
Right.
And so what I'm saying here is, in this statement, you can't just take these words. You have to understand the structure that you're trying to do, because as we discussed under contra Kant, this universalization, any good Kantian would accept do unto others as you would have them do unto you, and promptly put a bullet in the back of your head and say, got him. I shot first, but we accepted the universality of treating each other as equals.
If I'm a psychopath, you must be a psychopath.
That's right. So I'm just, this is just a caution, and
it's a very well taken caution.
But it's the kind of thing that Kenneth tries to do.
Yes.
That these simple things, which are good, they're good to help your memory. They're good to remind you of what you should do and think about, but they can be misunderstood and are probably more misunderstood than understood.
Right.
So I just, as this conversation went on,
you had to speak
up. I had to say this.
I'm glad you did.
That to do unto others as you would have is nothing but presumptuousness.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
So.
Well, it's because any attempt to express the infinite in finite language is doomed a priori. And so a statement like do unto others, the best it could possibly achieve is to be the finger pointing to the moon. And if you obsess over the finger and take the finger literally, like the dog does, then you'll never see the moon.
Well,
and here too, in order to do this correctly, what you have to do is not do what it actually says, but to think about each concrete situation from an infinite perspective.
If you say do unto others as you would have them do unto you, then you would say, as a precondition for that, I must know myself. Right. I must fall back on what is that?
Right.
What does it take when I do something to another person to ensure that I am treating them justly, doing something that's truly beneficial?
That's right.
And anyway, but I did hear, you can just imagine Kenneth.
Oh, yeah.
Presumptuous,
And cackling right after.
Oh, yeah. He just I got you. I have caught the sophist right here.
Did we engage in a little Verstand? I think we did.
So,
that.
Very good.
Thank you, Donald. Yeah, that's right on the money. thought terminating cliches. Even an attempt to express the infinite can be reduced to a thought terminating cliche if we're not careful. If we're not careful. And it's part of the way in which it was easy in some ways for Banausoi to take over the world from Aristoi. Not that Aristoi have ever really fully been in charge, but to create a world in which they could do what characterological genocide and exterminate Aristoi. It's easy because Aristoi don't have easy answers for anything. And anytime they have an easy answer, they have to turn around and qualify it because we're attempting to express the infinite and we're attempting to apply the infinite to finite situations. And we're attempting to do it not in the bad infinite way of Verstand, but in the good infinite way of Vernunft, where we attend to the concrete specifics of the situation, which means that every answer is different for every situation. And that's really hard to do, really hard to express, and it takes time. And it's hard to get an army marching on the basis of someone saying, well, that's not quite right either. And meanwhile, the guy's conquered your city.
A few weeks ago, there was a thing that Kenneth had written where he said that the good is at war with the perfect, or something. I forget how he said that, but it was talking about how an Aristos would view some situation. And it struck me at that time that that's exactly the opposite of the Benoistic militaristic thing, where the rule there is the perfect is enemy. Well, they always say don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
Right.
That is, hit quick. When you get a plan that looks like it might work,
just go for it.
Go for it.
Don't think too much.
Don't think too much. Quick action is better. Whereas the heuristic viewpoint is the reverse of that.
That's right. That's right.
So.
And that's why Verstand, why the Banausik mind wants to divide the world into little isolatable pieces that aren't dependent on each other in a great web of mutuality. Because if everything is interconnected, then all their simple-minded plans have all these unintended consequences that are their responsibility. And they don't want those responsibilities. They want the money without any of the obligations. And so they define away the obligations. Oh, I don't owe you anything. I'm an individual. And greed is good, and I should just, we'll stop the study of the effects of this drug on the human brain after 6 weeks, and we'll just assume that it continues like that over 6 years or 6 decades, because we're afraid that if we keep going, we might discover long-term consequences that we'd be held liable for, and then we couldn't profit as much. So the way to profit is to terminate the study early, deny the existence of any deeper long-term consequences, and thus we get what we want without having to grapple with what we actually did.
That's really something.
Is that Stalin? All problems are people problems. Kill the people and the problems go away.
That sounds like Stalin, but it really is just the expression of the modernist worldview, right? It's like as if when we defeat the civilization, we also burn all their literature and then tell everybody they were a bunch of savages when we got there and didn't have a bunch of cities and didn't have indoor plumbing, and didn't have literacy. If we just say all those things, then we don't have to never have to be accountable for the fact that we just erased a civilization.
You hear that Stalinist view expressed all over the place, even today, when people say things like, "Oh, just kill people. I don't like people. We're just a curse on the earth. We're a cancer."
The same thing.
That's exactly what you were saying, Donald.
Reductionist.
I was about to say what you just said, Rick. That's the controversy surrounding the release of the latest Alzheimer's drug, right? They're not quite sure.
Yep.
Yeah. Yes.
Not sure.
They're not quite sure if it's as efficacious as it says.
Yes.
And in fact, what you had, 3 of the members on the panel of the FDA, 3 of the physicians resigned because the complications and the efficacy of the drug, the complications are tremendous and the efficacy has not been proved.
Right.
But they're
After
releasing
it was unanimously rejected just a month or 2 ago.
Exactly. But they're releasing it, I think, because of a financial concern. It's going to be 56. Yes.
So
the
much
stock
money.
was up 50%.
Yes.
Yeah, because we're terrified of Alzheimer's. We don't want it. So we would rather buy an AirSat solution that might cause us all brain cancer in 4 years, then
If you read the literature on SSRIs, Prozac is no more effective in cases of mild to moderate depression than placebo.
Right.
And in fact, it induces a biological vulnerability to make people more depressed.
yes,
And it became the most successfully selling drug of all time.
yes,
It's the marketing, the branding, and the market.
yes.
The way the market is managed.
And see, this is part of what Kenneth Smith talks about when he critiques scientism, particularly. He's like, on the one hand, there is this fake science, like we see the FDA do, where the studies are heavily edited. And when I talk about 6 weeks, I'm quoting Wellbutrin, the original GlaxoSmithKline study for Wellbutrin, which got it approved by the FDA, lasted 6 weeks, because that's the law that the FDA goes by. If your drug doesn't show too many side effects within a 6-week study, we can then assume it will never show long-term side effects, and you can go to market. And you can go to market as long as the approval papers, which you can read online, say this drug can be prescribed for up to 6 weeks.
Mhm.
And of course, was it prescribed for just 6 weeks at a time? No, of course it wasn't. It was prescribed for 6 months, 6 years. And people are still on it who've been on it for decades now. And no study was ever done, ever, to investigate those effects. But we call it science. And we say, well, it was approved, so therefore it's scientifically proven that this is safe. That's what it means to be scientifically proven it's safe. It means they got over the tiny little bar they had to get over in order to go to market and make unbelievable amounts of money off of this thing. And so is that science? What is that? What is this process we're engaging? Well, we call it science. So is it or isn't it? Or
It's not, it's market, it's market driven. When science becomes market driven, then you defeat pure science.
Right.
And you see it very, very often.
Right.
And I think in the next section where he talks about soul and market, I rather enjoyed that because I just finished doing a program on the edX platform where they did money, markets, and morals. And the question is, the fundamental question is everything in society, should everything in society have a price?
Right.
They've already moved in that direction with NFT platforms. There's one in which every single person has a dollar amount associated with them, and you can buy or sell tokenized versions of that person that are theoretically supposed to appreciate or depreciate with their worth in society. It's a disgusting platform.
That's how we settle malpractice claims, I'm ashamed to say.
It is. Ironically, that is exactly how the Anglo-Saxon law code worked before the Norman conquest. Everybody had a weregild. That was their value. It was a specific amount of money. And if they were killed, then your killer had to pay that amount of money to the family. And if they did, it was settled. And the value of your weregild depended on a number of things like, were you upper class or lower class? Were you a man or a woman? Were you a slave, etc. So everybody had a price and you could kill them. Furthermore, they also had a related concept called an oath weight. And the oath weight was your weregild plus the weregild of all the people you could get to testify on your behalf that they agreed with you that you were right. And the purpose of this and that was to figure out, well, who was most likely telling the truth. And that's how they would decide the truth in a court of law, was, whoever had the greatest oath weight on the side of their argument. And it goes without saying that the way this was arranged is Anglo-Saxons had a greater weregild than the Britons did, who they displaced and colonized. So the whole purpose of this was over time to ensure that lawsuit after lawsuit, generation after generation, they whittled away at the holdings of Britons and transferred them to Anglo-Saxons. And that's how England became an Anglo-Saxon country. They couldn't do it by conquest, so they did it through this oath weight buying and selling of people schema, in which the devil was in the details. And I read an article by a historian who referred to it as Anglo-Saxon apartheid. So that's how the Anglo-Saxons conquered England, not militarily, but through these tricks in the legal code. And it's because they moved in such slow motion that the Britons didn't understand what had been done to them until a few generations later they looked around and realized they didn't own anything anymore. They'd lost it all in court over generations. Mm-hmm. Right. So the schematizing thing, these things like this have been used for millennia with people, but we're very good at it. It's modernism's whole thing. So I'm guessing soul and market is probably what we hit next time. we'll start in there. But let's go through the rest of our things for today in the section we've got. I think Marianne and Phil.
I wanted to go backwards a little bit to when Kenneth was talking about consumers are just part of a great hall of mirrors. And I think what you guys were saying is very true about the snake oil that we are buying. And that's really is a more serious thing than I was thinking about was the postage. How Amazon is almost cheaper. Like I have a whole bunch of toys I want to send to my grandson, and it's cheaper to rebuy them because of the postage. So I'm in this hall of mirrors. And the same thing with jeans for women, they're so elastic, you have to keep washing them. So you use a lot of water.
Yeah. Yeah.
In.
Yeah, we call ourselves the pinnacle of efficiency and say no civilization's ever been as efficient as we are. But experts who actually dig down into these things find that in almost every aspect of our economy, we are one of the most wasteful civilizations that has ever existed. The thing we're efficient at is extracting profit from everything. So we can get ourselves to burn through a lot of water. We can get ourselves to burn through a lot of wood, a lot of drugs, a lot of insulin, and along the way to maximize the return on shareholder investment. That's actually the only thing efficient about our system. In every other regard, capitalism is actually happier if there's less clean water, because less clean water is easier to control access to, and you can charge higher prices. And the fact that enormous numbers of people die doesn't actually have to impact their profits at all. They might make more money with fewer people if a bunch of people died of thirst, because the remaining people would be willing to pay even more to avoid having happened to them what just happened to the previous generation. And so we have all this programming in us about how the modern world works and what we think it's done. And the only solution to cracking through it is to really get to know any one field well enough and deeply enough and most experienced enough that you start to run into the contradictions between the propaganda that we were raised under and the actual circumstances that exist within each aspect of our lives. It's when you dig down deep enough that you go, well, none of this works the way that I was taught it works. This is remarkable. This is a weird house of cards with a bunch of bullies around controlling access to the things that people need. It's bizarre.
The waste really reinforces the fallacy of that Malthusian trap, which everyone has just fallen into.
Right.
So you know what? Everybody has to live like me, who I told my family and all my friends, I am not going to buy any more clothes for the rest of my life. I think I've said this before. That's one of the things I don't buy. I decide not to buy for the rest of my life. Shoes, I'm going to have to buy shoes because I walk a lot. So
yeah, there's no choice for that. But
can I just say something about waste?
Yeah.
Because I've lived in two different cultures and I come to maturity in one. In a culture like ours, where we waste so much, what it negates for us is our ability to problem solve.
Yes.
When you have scarcity, it's difficult to problem solve. And I've seen that so many, many times. The culture I came from, you had enough, but you had to maximize whatever that enough was. And so therefore you learn to problem solve and utilize the maximum efficiency. This culture does not. And for example, I came of age with cloth operating grounds where you would wash them, sterilize them, and reuse them. And I came to America and everything was paper. And I went, wow.
Disposable.
Yes. And and so it's a methodology, but it translates into a way of thinking.
That's right.
And applies equally to people, right? It's how the system views people. You can waste them and they are disposable. I want to advocate for Phil. He's been so patient.
Okay, Phil, go ahead.
Well, thank you. Finally.
You say a lot, Phil. You say a lot.
Well, I actually addressed this issue in one of my paintings, painted probably like 20 years ago. But I'll first say that don't confuse efficiency with exploitation. That's an important thing to understand. Okay. And the thing I want to comment about the equivalent sign, the equation sign, the two bars, is I have no problems if it was just that, because you have to then understand that it's a representation, an abstract representation. As long as people understand that, I think that's okay. What it has become, however, and this is what I actually address, is I have at the bottom of the picture, the lower part, maybe 1/4, 20% of the painting, was just the equation x triple bar x, not just equal. X is x, not represents x. This is where the problem is, okay? And above that is a fallen angel that, in a sense, have to live in contrary to this. And the problem we have is, in a sense, is that we have turned a representation into an identity,
Right.
which is the real problem, not just the equation sign, the equal sign, because that's just a representation. And in modern art in general, in Cubism too, because they're developing a language, is they always put in a thing that clues in that it is a false thing that you're looking at, not the thing itself. It is a equivalent. So they go out of the way to show you the stitching that's in the thing. So like the frames in the movie, not just the movie, that sort of thing. So in some sense, once you understand it's a representation, then you could see that as one step removed from a triple bar, that it is the thing itself. And when I responded to it, it was just simply in response in art. There was a movement called minimalism. Not that I hate the minimalism. They asked Frank Stella, who's a kind of prime advocate of minimalism in a sense, is like, what does minimalism represent? And he said, what you see is what you see. Not what you see is what you get. Which is I think what, like maybe Kodak or one of those photography things. What you see is what you get, because it's a representation, it's not the real thing. What you see is what you see, which is identity locked into itself. I think that together with another thing I went in with the story of is that this thing, particularly that kind of representation, in a sense, is with us, at least back to the Greeks, probably back to the Egyptians, right? Because this sort of self-identity, because part of the thing is we're caught with the self as a thing. I myself am caught in it, so we have to criticize ourselves. I always was puzzled by the hero Hercules. I don't know if he's just a hero or a demigod, but he is worshipped because he has this one virtue, which is that he has a magnificent body, and he could put his body into the world in a sense, right? And so his labor is venerated, but he is not a good guy. He is not a good guy. And the story I want to say is one of my favorite myths, when Hercules met Atlas. It's a wonderful myth.
I love it.
And when Hercules, he was charged by the gods to find the 3 golden apples. He went and searched the 4 corners of earth, and he couldn't find it. Finally, he ran into Atlas, and he said, "Hey, big guy, like, I'm charged by the god to find these 3 golden apples. Could you tell me where it is?" And Atlas says, yeah, I know exactly where it is. And he said, "Could you tell me?" And Atlas thought for a while, and he said, "God, it would be just so easy to take you there, but it's really, really difficult to describe," I guess in the words, how to get there, right? And so Hercules asked, "Well, could you show me how to get there?" And Atlas looked at him, "Love to, but unfortunately, you could see that I'm busy holding up the world." Right? And so Hercules thought for a while and said, hey, look, I think we could solve this. Why don't you let me hold the world for a while? And you could go get the apple for me, and then I could give you back the world, and I could have the apple and all that. And of course, Atlas says, "Oh, you little pipsqueak, you think you could hold up the world, right?" He says, "Yeah, I know that I'm not a big guy like you, but I'm incredibly strong. Perhaps you've heard of me. I'm Hercules, the son of Zeus, right?" And so Atlas hesitated, but finally gave him the world, like very carefully. And so now Hercules is holding up the world, and Atlas is now going to look for the apples and fetch the apples. And while he was gone, he's strolling through the hills and dales and the seashore and the wonderful sea breeze, sea breeze, and the smell of the sea and the sunlight and the chirping of the birds and the grass. And he says, "Damn,
This is nice.
life could be good if one was not burdened with having to hold up the world." Right?
Yes.
And so he, there's going to be trouble when he comes back. So he comes back with the 3 golden apples, and Hercules can see that this is going to be a problem to get him to do his job again, right? So he said, "Look, I understand, your hesitancy, but like I thought it was just going to be a short while you're just going to get the 3 golden apples, and I position myself wrong, and I don't know if I could hold up for long. Why don't you hold up the world for a while and let me do some calisthenics and whatever, and then this time I'll be sure to put the world in the right position that I could hold it for a long time." And so Atlas did so, and then Hercules pretended he did a few calisthenics and all that, and he just walked off.
Right.
He shucked
Thanks,
his
big guy.
responsibility, right? Atlas, who was a Titan, understood that things were going to be very, very bad if you dropped the world. Hercules didn't care. He got his apple, and there he goes, and that's it. He filled his duty, and now he could look. It's a wonderful story about what is our relationship between fetching our needs, which is a golden apple, the gift of the God, and what is our responsibility. If you think you've got responsibility, think about Atlas.
That's right.
I mean, think about Atlas, poor guy. I mean, he did his job despite everything. Okay, so that's a story I really always love, is to figure out how to balance your responsibility from your personal freedom, because Atlas knew that, damn, life could be good if you was just not burdened with the responsibility of holding up the world.
So we come back again. I like that story. And so we come back again to every day, the wearing of masks.
Yes.
Getting vaccinated.
Yes.
Your freedom versus your responsibility.
Right.
Yes.
Absolutely.
That's right. And what are the consequences if you drop your responsibilities just so that you can enjoy the good things of freedom indefinitely? And on the other hand, how much nicer it could be. Go ahead.
Phil, when was that story written? Or I've never heard of that story. When was it written?
I didn't read it directly. Somebody, a religious figure, a very left-oriented religious figure, actually told the story.
So it was
Charlie Rose a long time ago. Yeah.
What century do you think it was? Maybe
it's thousands of years old.
It's an ancient myth.
It's thousands of years
back to the Greeks. Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
One of the 14 labors, 13 or 14 labors.
Yeah, it's among the labors of Hercules. If you Google the labors of Hercules, you'll find it. And there's some good tellings of it out there. Although I think Phil did great justice to it. The moment when Atlas begins to realize, hey, this is pretty nice.
I
know. That's when trouble was brewing. Yeah.
I read something the other day where somebody asked, who is Heracles? That is
Heracles,
the Greek name for Hercules. Hercules is Latin. And the answer was, well, Heracles was a Greek god capable of Herculean efforts.
Mm-hmm.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it would.
It's like, when you do these bilingual jokes, Greek to Latin. They don't work so well sometimes.
It would be a problem if he was
I got it.
Sisyphus pushing the rock up the hill. No problem.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
isn't it Ayn Rand who wrote that book, Atlas Shrugged?
Yes, she's alluding to that. She's alluding to
That's
that myth.
right.
Yeah. So I think, Sharon, we didn't fully get into all of the people who Kenneth refers to in this opening section, because, you know, I see references to Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism, The Human Condition, Philip Reef's Triumph of the Therapeutic, and Fellow Teachers. You know, there's some Reef and Arendt stuff we didn't cover today, although we could. So since we're about out of time today, I think what we'll say for next time is, you know, we're probably going to do the next section next time. But if people do some reading on their own of Reef and Arendt and Merleau-Ponty and Bergson and others, then we could certainly start by getting into that at the beginning of next session.
It took a while for me to go through it because I had to look them all up, because Kenneth Smith's write in context. And I think if I don't understand the mention, then I don't get the context. I don't know if everybody is having that, if that is how it works, but that's how I'm receiving it.
That's exactly how it works.
When we mention all these different authors and books, does everyone on the call know about Z Library? I hope everyone does, but just on the off chance that you don't, you could get any book you could possibly think of for free in several different formats. And I'll just put a link in the chat. So
Yes,
if you want,
please,
Yes.
because I don't.
it's totally legal. It's totally legal. And yep, all the knowledge of the world at your fingertips for free.
Oh my goodness.
Have fun.
Thank you.
Dave, that's a game changer.
Is that it? Well, wait a minute. Let me look. Oops.
It's that B-OK.
On the chat. Is it on the chat? What is
Yeah.
it under?
Yes, it's in the chat.
And it's the
The last
H-
link.
B-OKCC.
Yeah.
That's right.
Great. Thanks a lot. That will help.
My pleasure.
Well, so my ignorance paid off, Rick.
Yeah, it did. Oh my God, rewards for everybody. So,
Sure.
yeah, go ahead.
That's why reading Kenneth Smith gets easier after 40 years.
Yes.
Yes, I don't have that much time left.
Yeah,
I wish you a long life.
yes.
Thank you.
One of
thank
the
you.
most alarming things about Kenneth Smith's essays is that even the ones you think you understand now, when you come back to them after 10 years of reading Kenneth Smith, you'll realize you might have missed the entire point, or some major thrust of the argument was something that we just brushed past because we didn't recognize that it was a reference and what he was talking about. So like a good film, it's something you can come back to and get new things out of every time you experience it. That's what I find.
Thank you very much for that, Dave, because that helps a lot. Because
Yeah.
I struggle around and I read and I look for these names and, well, what is he saying? I have to look at the main thrust of their arguments to contextualize what Kenneth Smith is saying.
You're limited to 5 downloads a day. I think we can all live with that. But
Somehow we'll survive.
Yeah, I guess so. Thank you, Rick. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you,
And
Dave.
David Roel, thank you for sending me the link today. And
So before we wrap up, David Roel, do you want to share with the group what you told me last night about the Australian philosophy group?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the plan is it'll be in October. A presentation on Kenneth Smith, but it will be on all the meetup groups. We'll post an advertisement, but it'll be on a Friday night. It'll be 9:30 p.m. Pacific time.
oh no.
Thanks
Oh
a
my
lot.
It's Australia.
Australia. What are you
So-
gonna do?
Oh, Australia.
Oh,
Oh la la.
No choice.
Which, yeah, it's like 2:30 p.m. in the afternoon, Saturday afternoon for them. But it'll be in October, and I guess it'll be Rick and I doing a dual head. And so that's in the planning stages, but it will be on the schedule and it'll be recorded somehow.
So it's going to
very
be
cool.
an introduction to an overview of Kenneth Smith's philosophy as a whole. And that means between now and October, David and I are
Do
going to
you
be
have
trying
a date yet? Do you
So
have a date?
between now and October, we'll stay up later and later and later, so that when that
To
day
get ready.
comes, yeah, we'll be able to stay up. Okay, all right, I'll work on it, David.
Yeah, no date yet has been set,
Okay.
just October. But so yeah, we're gonna be trying to condense down his entire lifetime of philosophy into one essay that introduces it all.
Okay, that should be very, very good.
I must be out of my mind to agree to try to compress Kenneth Smith that much. But hey, it'll be fun.
Yes, it would be a lot of fun.
So
Okay.
all right, see you guys next week.
Guys,
Thank
see
Thank
you.
later.
you.
This was very
Bye-bye.
good.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.